user experience. He worries about bugs. In fact, one of the first things that he did is he talked to guys at the help desk and he said, "Send me all the bug reports." We said, "Are you sure about that? Because there's a lot of tickets we get." And he said, "I want to see them. I want to drink from the fire hose." So he worries a lot about that. David flew out to my ranch here in Colorado and spent a week with us, and we've been giving David, Jeremy, and I a huge amount of information about Cardano. So he's going to be worried a lot about basically getting the Rust testnet where it needs to go and working with Bruno to get the Haskell team into a ship-ready delivery culture, but preserve the rigor and preserve the really cool ideas they have, and also make sure that we do proper reconciliation. This frees me up to do things like build partnerships, and it frees me up also to think about bigger, more significant features to the system, especially as we begin entering the Goguen era and later eras, which will include governance features and so forth, which are coming faster than you'd think. And we have to begin doing work now if we want to ship them in a reasonable period of time. So that's where we're at. Shelley is staking. Staking is coming soon. Either it's going to be on the Rust side or the Haskell side. More likely than not, the first test net will be Rust. We're right now priming a large group of people to participate. Anybody can, but we'd like to at least have some fairly good participants. The specs are entering candidate phase. There's some cases we'll have multiple specifications, like on the network stack. We're actually probably going to have 3 candidate specifications, one from the Rust, one that's being built on the enterprise side, which could be potentially reused in Cardano, and then what the network team has been doing on the Haskell side, which is about 50–60% done, give or take, maybe a little bit more. But they're converging to a final design, which has some really cool features about it, but it's implemented with dependent types, and there's a little bit of complexity there. So we have to kind of work our way through it and get our spec to where it needs to be. Okay, so I'll shut up now. That's your update. Now let's get to your questions. Aloha, Darcy. Is that the Darcy from the hotel in Lahaina? Okay, let's see here. Some of the questions you guys have. Yeah, that's a good question from CH about Windows input. Until the Rustival ends, cross-platform compatibility is an open question for the first generation. I suspect we will deploy to Windows, Mac, and Windows, but it's more of a DevOps question. And we have to wait for the software to reach a certain level of maturity before we get to the process of building things. My preference would be to have a turnkey Docker image that we deploy, but it may be that the first generation is a Linux push, and that's followed by a Windows and a Mac effort. Because you have to remember that it's a different user class when you're talking about a stake pool in particular. The user client is fine, and it's going to be a command line interface, the first client on the test net. But when you're talking about a stake pool, there's a high probability that people are just going to be deploying to something like Amazon Web Services or Azure, and they'll be dealing with a Linux server. And if that's the case, then it matters a little bit less about Windows interoperability there. The preferred environment for servers generally is Linux. But remember, that's for stake pools, not for Shelley consumer clients. We're, of course, going to have Windows, Mac, Linux, and mobile client interoperability there. Now, I see this one a lot, too. Will IXJ extend Cardano contract beyond 2020? We don't extend contract clients. Pay us more to do more work. But there's a scope of work with Cardano, and that scope of work will get done even if it takes additional time to do it. But I think we have a good chance of hitting all those milestones because the front part was heavy research, and we're now exiting heavy research and going to a hardcore implementation. And we kind of had to learn how to do that the way it needed to be done. And we're now converging as a company to being able to do really fast software development. So I think 2020, the end of 2020, is a reasonable deadline for everything that was what we were planning for that first generation. We need a treasury system, not just for us, but for everyone in the ecosystem who want to do things. Like, I don't want a situation where the Cardano Foundation has to somehow find a way to sustain itself so that it can continue giving grants to Clio or Tangem or other people. I want a situation where if you have a cool idea, you just go to the Treasury, you submit a ballot, and you go and make the case to the community directly. And then there's a democratic process upon which people approve or reject that, and that there's dedicated money for these people. If we get to that, then we're a very sustainable ecosystem because you don't have gatekeepers. The minute that you have somebody who decides at the top, that person's your king. It's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. So we're not going to stop till that treasury is done at the very least. And if there's still more work to do, then and we're not funded for that, then we'll submit a treasury ballot. But I don't think it'll take that. Okay. Yeah, actually, Nishant, the H-index, the highest H-index in our company, I think, is 75. And that's from Phil Wadler. He has 25,000 citations. All right, let's see what else we got here. Charles, is there any other way to make Daedalus Wallet download a little faster than how it is now? You know, it's interesting. I can download the wallet very quickly from Amazon because that's where we host it. But for certain groups of people, the wallet binaries, they download fairly slowly, like in several bits per second. And I'm not sure why that is. I've talked to my DevOps people, and they're starting to look into that. But then you might also be referring to how long it takes to download the blockchain. When the new network stack comes in, the blockchain will download much faster because instead of being shipped from just a relay, you'll have multiple relays and a peer-to-peer model, and then it'll ship kind of like a torrent in that case. But your mileage may vary. It depends on your ISP, your geography, your network configuration, and a lot of things can influence the rate at which a blockchain downloads. Ideally, we'd like to get to a world where you do not have to download the entire blockchain to be an effective network participant and to enjoy a reasonable level of security and not have to trust a third party. Now, there is a arms race right now in the cryptocurrency space of how do we get the next generation like client. And so you're seeing technology like Algorand recently proposed a paper called Vault. It's a very well-written paper, and the long and the short is that you don't have to possess the entire blockchain or UTXO to be able to use the system, and you'd still be able to verify that what you're looking at is secure as if you had the entire blockchain. There's also another proposal out of MIT called UTREXO, UTREXO, and it's a somewhat similar idea where they're pushing some of the work to the client, but you don't have to store or use the entire UTXO to get your security. We're also looking at taking our sidechains paper, the proof of stake sidechains paper, and saying, look, we can take the UTXO, we can take the Merkle root of the UTXO. So you put in every little leaf one of the entries, and then it builds its way up to a Merkle root, and you have that little thing. And then maybe every 10 blocks or 100 blocks, we put it in the header. And then basically what you would do is you would retrieve the most current UTXO, you retrieve the nearest header block, and you just get the chain back to that, and then you would verify that that UTXO matches the checkpoint. But then how do you know that that point is right? Well, you know it's right if you use the TMS construction that we have in the proof of stake paper. So those TMS signatures will be embedded periodically throughout the chain, epoch by epoch, and you just recursively walk your way back to the Genesis block, which is hard-coded into every client. So in reality, the total amount of data you need to download would only be a few megabytes. Potentially, and then you would still be able to verify that that UTXO you received is correct, which means that you can instantly start working. You won't necessarily have your transaction history, but what it means is that I can have a light mode with Daedalus and make that the default mode. So when you install Daedalus, you download a small snippet of things, and boom, your client just starts working. It's just like Yoroi in that respect. And then as a background process, you gradually upgrades itself to a full wallet, but it doesn't stop you from using your client. It also means that we could start having meaningful discussions about fast bootstrapping for recovery and these things without relying on a third-party explorer or other infrastructure. So we're working on that, and Macaulay at Algorand is working on his thing, and MIT's got their thing, and the guys over at Unity have their thing. In fact, we invited all of them to come down to the IWHK Summit, and there's going to be some good people there. And we'll talk to them about their best available process. But they're writing papers, we're writing papers, and there's going to be a grand convergence of these things. What does it mean for you, the consumer? It means that you're not going to have to ever do what I had to do when I joined the space, which is download a Kludgy client, wait a really, really long time for the chain to propagate, to fully download, and then use it. Instead, you're just going to download it and use it like you do a cell phone app. And then you'll wake up one day and your client happens to be more useful than it was before, but you didn't have to wait for that. It just organically kind of happened. Okay. Let's see what we got here. What will happen to Cardano coins that get lost via lost keys and alike? Well, you know, Satoshi Nakamoto had an opinion on that. He said that that's like a little gift to everybody in the Bitcoin ecosystem whenever anybody loses their coins. And that was 2009, 2010 thinking on Bitcoin Talk when the stakes were quite low. It is a bit disturbing when you say, hey, we have a global financial system, and this global financial system is going to replace the dollar or be an alternative financial operating system for the entire world. But then there is no recovery model when something like, for example, the CEO of an exchange dies and his private keys are lost with him. Or what happens when you have inheritance situations? You know, when grandma dies, you know, and she's the last living member, well, how do you actually give her crypto to the kids? You know, what's that process if she never wrote her keys down or they got lost in a fire or something like that? We live in the real world, and when these things happen, we have meat space human processes to transition and move funds that have been lost or remediate from theft or so forth. But in the crypto world, we don't quite have that. So there's two schools of thought. One school of thought says that you put a governance layer in your system, and then if there's an issue, you go to the governance layer with some evidence, and you say, governance layer, I have this evidence, and as a consequence, you can clearly see that what happened was not what we intended, a la DAO. And there's another school of thought that says buyer beware, and if it happens, code is law, and you're just going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And I say in a certain respect, both are right. And actually, I think in a certain respect, both of these things can actually live together in one ledger. And how you do that is you say, look, we're going to have differentiation on the address level and on the smart contract level for storage and use of funds. So basically what you do is you say, I consent to having my funds controlled by a governance system or having some sort of restoration process in the event that I get hacked or an issue occurs. So I'm going to move my funds to a specially constructed address or to a smart contract that has a bunch of logic that basically allows those funds to be redistributed, allows the private keys to move from one set to another set, whatever you want. So there's logic within there. And this is the magic of smart contracts that lets you do that. And then we can have an argument as a community of, well, what are the best practices we should have? But here's the thing. Whatever we implement is voluntary. So you get to decide whether you consent to that kind of a system. And if you don't like it, there can be a competing system. For example, in finance, there's Islamic finance, and there's more than 1 billion people that need Sharia-compliant investment products, and they can't participate in certain forms of investment or financial practices out of religious respect. And there's also funds that can't invest in certain things because of ethical reasons. For example, Norway has one of the world's largest sovereign funds, well over $1 trillion of money. And Norway puts very strict ethical guidelines on what they can invest their sovereign fund in. And if you happen to be doing those things, even if you're a great investment, the country of Norway won't give you money. So similarly, you can vote with your values and move your funds to an address, to a smart contract that carries those particular values. So that's the magic of where we're going with these things. We will build some of them, and then we can leave it to third parties to build the rest. Now, some people say that you shouldn't even allow this to be voluntary. You should have such a pervasive governance system that the ledger can do things like reverse transactions, reissue money, create new money. For example, the Tezos governance system conceivably could allow you to create new money, blacklist old money, and EOS has actually already reversed transactions. I do not think that that's ethical or wise. We haven't resolved in any shape or form the governance problems of the United States or Europe or the rest of the world. So why are we to believe that somehow we're so much smarter that when hundreds of millions of people in aggregate can't quite get a government to work properly, that some hackers in their basement are going to just dream up the perfect governance system that will then be permanently in plutocracy or an oligarchy? And this is a committee not as subject to any particular jurisdiction's laws. It's like a meta government. So you have no recourse or no appeal. So I think that's a really, really, really bad idea. And honestly, I feel that it's much better to make these things voluntary and then for us to argue about what's the best way of implementing them. And then once you've consented to something, both parties agree that that's fine. What does this mean? It means that every now and then grandma makes a mistake. Every now and then an exchange makes a mistake. And in which case you've reduced the total supply of the system, which is a gift to everybody. So at the very least, your mistake in a way helped other people get a little bit more value, and it helped everybody get a little wiser. And I frankly feel that you need consequences and a cost for an action for it to be meaningful. If you always know that you have an insurance policy that no matter what you do, you can get bailed out, you start behaving as if there are no consequences to the way you do things. For example, with Wall Street, when Greenspan gave them a put, and he said, hey, I'll always make the stock go up. Or later, central bank leadership that allowed the mortgage crisis to exacerbate to a point of crisis. And the banks didn't really care because they said, well, you know, we'll make the windfall profits today. And if the system collapses, we'll get bailed out, and nice retirement packages. You have to create consequences for a feedback loop to organically improve. If Apple releases a crummy phone or Samsung releases a phone that explodes, they get sued and they have bad press. They lose lots of sales, billions of dollars. So as a consequence, they have to put in good processes to avoid these types of things from happening. If they said, if I release a crappy phone, the Korean government's just going to give us a subsidy to make up for the lost profits, or the US government's just going to bail us out, well, then do they particularly care if the phone is good or bad? Not so much. And that's why certain systems like the education system, the healthcare system in the United States are so horribly broken, because they've disintermediated the consumer and their purchasing behavior from the quality of the product and the outcome of the product. The third parties generally pay, either via student loans or insurance. So they can just increase the cost, reduce the quality, make worse outcomes, and we're at loggerheads. Ticket prices from Raul. He asked about discounted tickets for the summit. Yes, there will be a discount if you buy with ADA. ADA Pay is almost done. We're working with ATIX on that. They're basically building an interface. We're using Eventbrite for our ticketing system, so we're building an extension to Eventbrite that allows us to basically accept ADA payment. It just takes a little bit of time to do that because these systems were not designed to talk to each other. So we've been building it for the last month, and that's almost done. And once it's done, we'll be able to accept ADA payments for the tickets and use the singular system for ticketing. There's an advantage to not having parallel systems because it's a huge logistic overhead if you have parallel systems, because you'll have one big piece of automation that Eventbrite provides, and that's super turnkey and easy, but then you have these other tickets. So what that would effectively mean is anybody who bought a ticket with ADA would show up and say, hey, I bought a ticket. And then we say, oh, you're one of those ADA people. You have to go to that box over there. And we'd have to have like a different line or something. And I would much rather everybody's in one process and one system. So that meant we had to build a bridge. And so the bridge is nearly done. And once it's done, we'll accept it. It should be the 18th, but maybe a day or two. But I don't think it'll slip too much. But we're pretty much on target for that. And the system will let you buy a ticket pretty easily. and ADA tickets will be discounted. I think it's 15% or 20%. I'll have to talk to Carrie, but it's a nice discount as a sign of appreciation to our ADA holders. Now, I've gotten a little bit of pushback on the ticket prices. If you go to the consensus event that CoinDesk is putting on, the early bird prices are $1,200. And I've been to well over 30 conferences last year, actually 58 events last year. Not all of them were conferences, but I've seen ticket prices from $100 to $4,000 a ticket. And I feel that the prices that we're charging are fairly reasonable. Now, it's important to point out that we are not planning on making a profit from this conference. The reason why we're selling tickets is that we are flying out every single IOHK employee, and in many cases, family members, and we renting a big venue, and we're providing a lot of value. And the cost of doing this is the minimum of $1 million for us. So the hope of the tickets is to recoup the cost of bringing all of our people together. We also are getting some very good speakers to come in addition. So a lot of great academics have already RSVP'd, and they'll be there for panels, including some of our competitors, and they'll be able to go there and make the case why their protocols are better than our protocols. We also have some surprise guests that are pretty fun. And we recently signed up a very, very nice musical guest, actually 2 musical guests. One is a world famous musician. Well, actually, both of them are famous bands that have been around for a while. If you buy a VIP ticket, you actually get to go to the VIP concert. So I think there's just going to be a lot of value there. There's hackathons, workshops. Some of them are going to talk about zero knowledge proofs. Some are going to talk about Plutus. Some of them are going to talk about a lot of the engineering principles we use, how to use NICs. There's going to be a crypto puzzle where we're going to take an ADA wallet, take the keywords, and break them apart into 4 different puzzles. One will be on the T-shirt, and 3 more throughout the conference hall. And the first person to break all 4 of those puzzles will get the ADA. And there you go. No purchase necessary. There's just dozens of other little things like that. And there'll be some good sponsors and so forth. And it's also an opportunity to not just meet me, but meet literally everybody in my company. So if you ever want to meet Phil Wadler or Agalos or Duncan or Bruno, or see some of the other people that make the magic happen, they're going to be there. And in many cases, giving presentations, and you can directly interact with them, and we can do some cool stuff together. So it's also the Emerco people will be there, and the Cardano Foundation will be there. We partnered with Tangem, and we're hoping that everybody who attends the conference will also get a free Tangem wallet. So that's a lot of value, and we'll just keep adding and adding and adding as the weeks go on and more people get interested in attending. So I feel that the ticket prices are quite fair. And again, the hope is just simply for the tickets to recoup the investment of bringing all of our people together. This also gives us a chance to work towards something as a company. And we'd like to show a lot of really cool accomplishments by the summit, or else it would be a pretty boring summit. So in many ways, the existence of a summit like this and the fact that we have that accountability of a deadline kind of forces you to work under pressure and do your best work and get things out quicker. So it accelerates the launch of Shelley. It accelerates our competitiveness. It shows off all the things we've done. It'll help us dispel this myth that we're just a white paper and we're just a bunch of academics who have no idea how to ship anything. And it'll also allow us to make the case why Cardano is the best cryptocurrency in the world, and why we feel we have a good shot of getting to #1 and getting the ecosystem to be very dominant. And we're also going to fly out the Ethiopian class. All the gals who have been training, the ones who pass will, pending their visas getting cleared, will be able to come and do a presentation. So you can actually see firsthand the output of our education efforts in Africa, and our entire enterprise team is going to be there. So if you're curious about how we're doing the blockchain side of things, the summit will have those people there. So that's a lot of value for a $500 ticket. And I feel that people are complaining about these prices. Either they don't go to cryptocurrency conferences, and most of them are useless, or they're just being a little stingy. And it's not to make money here; it's just to break even, and also gives me a chance to bring all my people together. I miss them, and that's one of the tragedies of running a decentralized company. While it has a lot of benefits, the downside of running a decentralized company is that you don't get to see people that you've become friends with every day. If I had just everybody who worked in the same office come in, I'd have my coffee and I'd be able to go door to door and say, hey, what are you working on? And and we'd be able to have a great conversation, go out to lunch, go get some drinks together. But sometimes I'm a little isolated, and I can just talk to them over Slack. And I can't travel everywhere. I tried last year. I went to 30 countries. So bringing them all together for a big event is just great. And it's really heartwarming. And it means I finally get to see everybody again. Last time I did that was in Portugal in January of 2018. So it's simply been too long. Okay, let's see what we got here. How is Cardano attacking interoperability, cross-chain atomic swaps? Yeah, that's a good question. So interoperability needs to be basically two things. First, you need to be able to move value between chains. And second, you need to move information between chains. So it would be nice that you can query Bitcoin and ask it, tell me your state. I need to know something about you. What's going on? What does this block look like? And you can get that information and know with reasonable degree of certainty that that feed of information you're getting is correct. Because there's events that happen everywhere in legacy financial systems and in the traditional crypto world that if you're running a smart contract might be event driven, and it has to process all those events, aggregate them, and understand, well, what does that mean for you? And that could be a trading contract. It could be like if this person dies, give me the inheritance, whatever it might be. There's a lot of little factors there. So when we say interoperability, generally we're either talking about I can move a token from one system to another system, or I can move information or understand information from one system to another system, either the outside world, another cryptocurrency, or the legacy business world. So everybody has an opinion on how to do this, and opinions are like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other protocols aren't necessarily the best protocols. They're just the ones that ended up winning, and now everybody's using them. And there's probably at least one person in those spaces that said, mine was better. And here are these objective, tangible, factual reasons why it's better. But just like in the VHS versus Betamax, or the HD DVD versus Blu-ray, or PlayStation versus Xbox, there's winners and losers in business and in standards. And at the end of the day, somebody's going to win. And so the name of interoperability is be pragmatic. So whatever the standard is, support that. And we're going to do that. But it is probably a good idea to have a reasonable conversation about proposing standards. So first off, there are two principal consensus algorithms used in the cryptocurrency world. There are others, but two are proof of stake and proof of work. So we have protocols to be interoperable with both classes of systems, the proof of stake sidechains and the NEPIP system. So we're going to be advocates of those protocols, and we already are, and we're going around and saying, hey, here's an improvement proposal. You all should adopt this. You get great light clients, and you get the ability to talk to each other. We'd love to see that happen. Now, there are other things. For example, there are DEXs for like Kyber, and they facilitate atomic cross-chain swaps, so you can move value. There's also protocols like Interledger, and there's even discussions about using the Lightning Network as kind of a universal layer 2 compatibility system between different ledgers. There's no reason why we couldn't do that. So we've assigned a product manager to look at Lightning and basically look at all the different proposals that exist. And we're in a really fortuitous situation where we have a natural set of nodes to run these types of things, namely the stake pools. So in addition to maintaining a state of ledger, they can also maintain these meta systems like Oracle services or Lightning nodes. And we may be able to achieve interoperability through that layer. They can act as bridges for Interledger, which is a protocol from Ripple. And we'll look at these things, and we'll probably roll them out as soon as Shelley and Goguen are out, because we'll have enough capabilities in the ledger, and it'll be fairly straightforward to do that. Now, closely related to interoperability is a discussion about metadata, and this is really, really, really important. Metadata is kind of like the secret sauce of your transactions. So, for example, you have two events, and they're the same value. So they're the same type of transaction. Bob withdraws $500 from his ATM. Now, doesn't matter, it's Bob and an ATM. It's the same structural thing. It's going from one unit to another unit, pulling it out. One case, here's the metadata. Bob does it right next to a restaurant, and it happens to be Christmas, and his family happens to be in town. Bob's taking the family out for dinner for Christmas. That's what you would infer from that event, more likely than not. The next case, Bob is pulling $500 out of an ATM at a known brothel right next to it. Probably imagine Bob's doing something else. Now, this is the same type of transaction. It's Bob taking his $500 that he owns and just going with it. But the implications of that transaction are very different. So what does that mean? It means metadata, in many cases, is more important than the transaction itself. So how do we reconcile this? Well, one school of thought says metadata doesn't belong on the blockchain, and also it's very personal, it's very particular. And do we really want to live in a world where all this stuff is preserved forever? On the other hand, if you don't in some way represent the metadata of the transaction on the blockchain, well, then that means your metadata is no longer immutable, audible, and timestamped. In which case, you can move one set of metadata to another set of metadata. So you can make the family dinner look like the brothel if you wanted to. And whereas Bob may not have the ability to get recourse, so you can effectively deep fake the world into believing that you've done something that maybe you didn't do. For another example is the commercial intent behind a transaction. When I sent you money, it was usually because there was some sort of commercial understanding. It's a donation. It's a purchase for products. It's a trade for services. I give you this to mow my lawn. And again, the metadata is basically the story of why did I send you that money? So if blockchains are to be interoperable, they do have to, for either compliance reasons, legal recourse, refunds, a litany of other commercial understandings, have to have a metadata component. Because when you're moving value between ledgers, the metadata is going to flow with, and oftentimes just as important. So what are we going to do with Cardano? Well, at the very least, what we're going to do is allow people to take the hash of the commercial intent of the transaction and do contingent settlement transactions. So what the heck is that? Contingent settlement is where Alice sends something to Bob, but Bob doesn't get it until Bob agrees to the terms of service. So for example, let's say a donation. Alice is sending X amount of ADA to Bob to donate to his organization with some terms and conditions. I'll only give you this $1 million if you name your science building after me for a university, for example. Okay, so she'll take that agreement, hash it, sign it, embed it into the transaction, send the transaction to Bob. It sits in pending, it's contingent. And then through a different band, probably PubSub, Bob will receive the agreement, read it, agrees to it, hashes it, signs it, embeds it into the transaction. And only when both of those components are there does the transaction settle. So what does this mean? It means that now that Bob has the funds. So let's say he doesn't name the building. Then what Alice can do is go to the court and say, court, Bob agreed to do this. And she has a contract. She has his digital signature. And now many jurisdictions, Wyoming now, Alice has legal rights. And that's as good as it is. And that's metadata has been timestamped. It's auditable. It's immutable. It lives there. Now, you can systematically construct from this basic primitive, arbitrarily complex financial arrangements. And in many cases, perhaps even automate these financial arrangements and have outsourceable servers that live off-chain that coordinate things. So you can have a private part of the deal that only certain actors know, and then you have a public part which is preserved and that metadata is represented properly. So these capabilities will work their way into Cardano, and they don't quite take a lot of effort to do, and they're easy to overlay, and they work very nicely with smart contracts, and instantly it allows you to now have a very elegant system to sign contracts and a very elegant system to tell the story of why you're sending money, what you're doing, what is this all about. And if we did install governance systems, like for example, you embed these types of transactions into those smart contracts I mentioned earlier, then that governance system would have something to work with. The arbitrators there would look at the metadata and say, yes, clearly you did receive this money to do X, and there's no evidence that you did that, so we're going to give Alice her refund. Okay. All right, let's look at the rest of the questions we got here. Donald Obama. That's an odd name. I get this question a lot. In practice, how many Fortune 500 companies are using blockchain or cryptocurrencies? Some are using blockchain. We talked to them, but the majority are not using crypto, including JP Morgan Chase. They've decided to create their own coin. See, that's what we were saying a long time ago. All right, let's see what else we got here. Is RENA still a thing, or did we do a new approach? I was watching the old whiteboard video. You know, whenever you set up an aggressive research agenda, you do a lot of high risk, high return research. And what you do is you start for gold. You say, look, it'd be super cool to get all of these things. And RENA was one of those high risk, high return mega projects that basically we said, let's go shoot for it. Let's go try it and see how far we can get. So the Haskell team has kind of a spiritual successor, like a micro version of RENA that has a lot of the concepts and principles of RENA embedded within it, and they're working their way towards that. And there are certainly a lot of progress has been made. And the other problem with RENA is it's not 100% fit for purpose for a peer-to-peer system. It requires some slight modifications with how diffs work. So we've done a heck of a lot of research, and we thought about it. I asked Neil and Peter and others in our company to give me an estimate of how much would it cost to do all of RENA the way that they wanted to do it. And their estimate was about $10 million and 600 man-months of engineering. And that was a preliminary estimate, which was, of course, going to be subject to your standard cost overruns and delays. So what we did is we scaled RENA back a little bit, and then we said, let's take the best concepts and ideas we think for a shorter time horizon, a 1 to 3 year horizon, and let's go chase those. And if we accomplish that, it puts us in a really good position for later generations of the protocol to move in that direction. RENA, in its grandest and most purest form, would require special hardware, and that might make sense if we're talking about satellites. It may make sense if we're talking about mesh nets. So as ADA grows and we start trying to escape the regular internet and imagine a new, more fair internet, especially in places that are first getting it for the first time, it'll make a lot of sense to go in that particular direction. And because we have no loyalty to legacy protocols, it allows us to have a clean slate. Networking is among one of the most opinionated and complex issues, because a lot of the times the things that you want to do, you can't do. So what you have to do is basically play a game of, well, how do I do the least harmful thing to my user base? It's almost like neurology or brain surgery. Generally speaking, you don't make your patients healthier when you treat them. You're just slowing down the degeneration. When someone has Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, or someone has a brain tumor, it's not exactly like you're going to say, okay, here's this drug, I've cured your condition. No, it's more like, I can give you an additional 2 to 3 years of meaningful life. Similarly, when you're dealing with networking, you can have these ideal, beautiful protocols that have lots of security and great properties, but they have to be deployable and live on the regular internet, which is constrained and subject to older hardware, very older protocols, and a lot of suboptimal design decisions that are provably bad and exploited on an often basis. So a ton of complexity in the implementation of network protocols comes from hardening your protocols to defend yourself against the imperfections and mistakes of the original internet. And it's just a sad reality of where we're at. And that's why it's so hard to innovate in this particular space, and so frustrating to innovate in this space. And a lot of times when people care so deeply about performance and reliability, they build their own networks that are out of band, and they don't go on the general internet. So we still have RENA in our heart, and we've learned a heck of a lot by pursuing it. But the grand RENA with the capital R is probably not going to work its way into Cardano in a 2020 horizon, but some variant of its concepts will, and it'll be sufficiently good, I think, to be a major innovation over how cryptocurrencies work. If you look at the space, Protocol Labs has done good work with libp2p, and there's been certainly a lot of discussion. Like the Unit E guys are, a lot of them are network guys, so they're thinking a lot about how to improve network stacks. But unfortunately, this is an understudied area, and it's something that we badly need innovation in. Because we're starting, when we bring these second generation or third generation scaling protocols in, we're going to reach massive theoretical bottlenecks. where our bottlenecks are no longer the consensus algorithm being bottlenecked, but rather being able to move the information between people. And if you have a homogeneous gossip protocol that's naively implemented, you're basically going to end up self-DDoSing or something when you have too much flow. And you need things like back compression, hardening asymmetry attacks, and protection from eclipse attacks and so forth. So working our way towards it. When bankrupt, never. When delisting, never. We're doing good, guys. Gotta love these trolls, though. Nostradamus, can you help the yellow vests in the French Revolution with smart contracts for them to vote? Population is asking for citizens' referendum. I think we can have millions of people adoption. You know, it's really tragic that we have people who want to express themselves in the world, and we still live in a world where there are a small group of actors who seem to control the global narrative about the intent and meaning behind what you do. We'd like to believe we live in a time of the Enlightenment, and if you have an argument or you want to say this is what you intend and what you meant, that you'd be listened to, people give you a fair shake. Unfortunately, what happens is that a protest occurs, and the protesters are there for a reason, but then somebody decides to take that and put their own spin on it and say, well, this is what the protest was really about. In the United States, we had Occupy Wall Street. We also had the Tea Party before Occupy Wall Street. And there were, in some cases, embedded within that movement, very, very legitimate grievances about the way society is structured. And in many ways, it feels that it's just fundamentally unfair. And the yellow vests are no different in that respect. But what's unfortunately happened is the media still has a huge amount of power to make these things seem like what they're not, or in some cases, just completely bury these things. We had a populist uprising in 2009 in Iran that was so vicious it actually nearly overthrew the government. We had pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong, which were brutally shut down, and people used mesh nets to communicate with each other. The same for Mubarak in Egypt, and at least that one was successful. So it's not my job as a designer of protocols to take sides. I would be compromised, and I would ultimately diminish my effectiveness in building these protocols. I must be like a judge. I must be dispassionate and neutral. It's my job, however, to build the best capabilities possible and make those capabilities as accessible as possible to everyone, so that people can take those capabilities for whatever their particular movement happens to be. Whether it's legitimate or not, that's for the rest of society to decide, but it allows them to take it and at least be able to express themselves without fear of coercion, manipulation, reprisal, or corruption of the message. And if people attempt to corrupt the message or to get retribution for it, that these tools also can allow society to see that front and center. So that's an idealistic dream. It's an idealistic goal, but it's, I think, something that is obtainable within my lifetime. So what does it mean? It means that we need to use the best processes, and we need to use the best available engineering. But at the end of the day, these things are only going to work if the general public knows how to use them and decides to use them and thinks that they're important to use them. And that's a moral choice. And I can't make that for them. All I can do is build things. I'd like to see within my lifetime a fundamental change in the incentives of journalism. I think they're fundamentally broken at the moment. Journalism is not about reporting reality, and it's not about ensuring that people get a fair and accurate representation of what happened. Journalism is about creating hype and excitement and ultimately entertainment. Because at the end of the day, on a broadcast system, usually you have no power. You can't really do anything about it. So if you turn it into an interactive drama, at least people feel like they're part of the play, they're part of the show, even though they're just watching history move by, they're not making it. So we see interactions, headlines, stories, fact-checking, all these things which are just not constructed anyway for productive dialogue. which actually why you see systems like the intellectual dark web be so prominent and powerful. Because at least there, instead of having these clickbait headlines and small blog posts that who cares if they're right or wrong, who cares what we say, there's no consequences, you have long debates which do not terminate with just one video. For example, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris have been going at it, and the secular humanist movement have been going at it with Jordan Peterson about, well, is God useful and does God exist and should we believe in God? It's an interesting question. And we see numerous debates and both sides are going at it, but they're going at it in a constructive way where they're actually not attacking each other personally. They're not going after, is Jordan a good person or Sam a good person? They're actually going after the crux of the argument. And we're actually making social progress as a consequence of these things, but not just for the nature of God, but also things like policy. Should we have universal basic resources? These types of conversations. And if that's not okay, well, then what is the alternative? And will the alternative create a situation where all that collective wealth that's been created by those people and their companies could actually be compromised or destroyed, like what we saw in Venezuela? So these are tough questions, and they're very nuanced. They're multivariate. The Yellow Vest situation is just another reflection of that. And oftentimes, those types of protests are symptoms of a broader problem where there's groups of society that are afraid the way things are going, that they're going to ultimately be left out and put into a position where they're basically indentured servants to a system. They'll wake up every day, work hard, no matter what they do, what education they get, the content of their character, the quality of their merit, they're stuck in the mud. So imagine conceptually if you were born and somebody just put a $5 million debt at a 5% interest rate on your head. No matter what you do, unless you get exceedingly lucky, like win the lottery, or you start a business and somehow that business ends up being crazy successful, more often than not, you're just basically permanently in debt. Now, if you could take that and say that there's a social component to that, and if you're put into a particular class or you live in a particular economy or environment, it's effectively the same deal. And we see this in many different countries. Like the United States, we have areas which have systemic poverty. The Appalachian Mountain Range, if you live in West Virginia and you come from like a coal mining area, or in Pennsylvania, it's the same way in certain areas, it is really hard to get ahead in life. Not many jobs, high unemployment rate, and the places where you can get a job pay less or are no longer hiring. So you don't have a lot of options. So either you leave, in which case you're leaving your family, your friends, and the things that you know and love, or you stay and you accept a very, very bad job, or you accept having to just scrape by. And as a consequence of spending everything you make, you actually get systematically poorer because wages are not increasing with inflation. So as a consequence, what does it mean? It means that you don't have the ability to create a savings, and you're basically a slave to the system. And your buying power is going down every year because of U.S. monetary policy. It's a bad deal. Now take that and replicate that to millions of people, and you got a movement. And those people are going to have a voice and say, we want something better. And it's not good to just look at them and say, well, yeah, if they just only got a college degree, that would somehow solve the problem. Or if they just only learned to program, that would just solve the problem. It's patronizing, and in many cases, it does nothing. Or it would require sacrifices, which mean that they're able to get ahead at the expense of other people. So I see these movements, whether it be Occupy or Yellow Vest, as symptoms of broader social problems. And I see the frustration that people have in that the systems of communication we have and the narrative that the media propagates is not fit for purpose for us to actually have a discussion about how are we going to solve things. My industry, this entire industry only exists as a consequence of the system, the legacy system being bankrupt. We're not the criminals. The whole reason we exist is because they are. There's no greater example, recent example of this than what JP Morgan has done. In 2017, the CEO says Bitcoin is for criminals. It's a scam. It's a bad deal. And now they're launching their own token. And that's totally okay, and apparently that's fine. And but yeah, there's no value in anything we do. But when they do it, it's fine. And let's just shut up and be patient and enjoy it. It's insulting, it's patronizing, and it's endemic of larger problems. So instead of saying, hey, let's just accept it and that's the way life is, for the first time in human history, we have social tools, cryptocurrencies, and the derivative protocols of them to actually be able to do something about it. You don't like your money, make your own money. You don't like the way consent and voting works, build a different system. And I think over time, this will have a huge impact and eventually topple society as it was and replace it with something a bit better. Do you think there's something better than proof of work or proof of stake to replace the current protocol? Well, there are certainly people that run around and they claim that they have the thing to solve all your problems. Like the latest two that I've seen are Avalanche and Hashgraph, where they say they're just so much better conceptually that you shouldn't even think about proof of work or proof of stake. You know, these things are just dead and dying, and they ought not to exist. First off, you have to think about the philosophy of what your consensus protocol is saying. The value of proof of work is that it is assembling lots of computational power. It's bringing a lot of computing power together. Now, the mistake of Bitcoin is that that computing power, because of the nature of the protocol, is effectively useless and always will be useless. It's ASIC optimizable, meaning that you can go do one thing and build special hardware to do that thing faster than everybody else. And it's just a game of doing that one thing over and over again. And it provides no value, no benefit to society other than the fact that you can do that one thing. That's a really bad way of doing things, but it was a necessary way of doing things to bootstrap the ecosystem. What's much more meaningful is saying like the GPU or CPU-based algorithm, where because of some design of it, the only way you can do that thing is to use a general purpose computer. Then you're doing two things now. Instead of just saying we're solving problems, you're also saying, oh, by the way, I've just built a grid computer with hundreds of thousands of machines that have a lot of capacity to work on general problems like folding proteins, like storing data and verifying that you possess that data. You know, things like searching the stars for alien life, whatever that might be. So the next generation of proof of work will be less about, you know, how do we achieve, you know, more optimal ASIC, and it's going to be a lot more about saying, let's better use the fact that we've aggregated all this raw computational capacity, which will auto upgrade because it's consumer hardware without having to pay for that upgrade. And let's now steer this computational capacity in a productive direction. We've seen some flirting with these ideas with things like Primecoin. That was the very first example, and later papers like Permacoin and a paper out of Berkeley called Useful Proof of Work. And my hope is the proof of work system will move in that particular direction. In addition to getting rid of the mining pool monopolies and also, you know, embracing quality DAG stuff and so forth. In terms of concepts like throughput and latency, the protocols have evolved to a point where throughput can be considerably increased. So you can get things that are tens of thousands of TPS if you really want to, and the trade-off profile is increasingly getting more reasonable. And in confirmation latency will get better as well over time. And we wrote a paper on the relationship between the two and some theoretical maximums of what you can and can't do. Proof of stake is a fundamentally different system. It found a way to replicate the lottery of proof of work, but doesn't require computational capacity. And actually, I'll tell you one of my proudest moments in my career in the entire cryptocurrency space. It came very recently, and it's something I'll mention at the IOHK Summit. And boy, it's really magical. I was talking to Marcus, and Marcus had told me that he's trying to get a stake pool to work on a RockPi board. Now, RockPi it sells, it's ROCKPI, and it sells for like $70. It's a very low cost device, and it only uses a few watts of power, like 4 watts of power. And if once we have this testnet out, we'll try to compile it and run it, and we'll work really closely with them because I'd love to do this. But here's the long and short. One of these little boards, which is basically the size of a cell phone, kind of actually looks like this calendar. This is about how big it would be. with everything in it. One of these little boards, 4 watts of power, can run a stake pool. And if that's the case, you'd only need 1,000 of them to run 1,000 stake pools. So you're running an entire system, a global scale financial system, 5 kilowatts of electricity. That heater right there uses about 1.5. So I just need a few of those. And I can run a global scale system that's 100 times more decentralized than Bitcoin, 30 times the throughput, confirmation times 15 times faster. Think about that. 5 kilowatts. That's about 20 solar panels. If you're doing those 250 watt solar panels, you could power a global scale financial system. And it'll get more power efficient over time. It's unbelievable that you could build a system like that and have it work. And that's a consequence of good protocols, and that's a consequence of good science. And it's humbling to think that that's how far we've gone in just such a short period of time. And very quickly we'll converge there. So anyway, proof of stake is less about power consumption. It's as low as it's going to get. 5 kilowatts is nothing. It's now about talking about who should be in control. So what proof of work does is it punts, and it's a meritocracy. It's an exogenous system. It lives outside of your system, and whoever the hell can figure out ASICs and subsidized power and that very weird, sharky, predatory game, they're your masters, and just accept that they're smarter than you and they're in control. And once they get in control, it's usually an aristocracy, and they're in that game. And unless you're very rich, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and great connections, you're just not going to be in that club. So don't even think about it. And they're total control of the whole thing. Whereas proof of stake, that's basically saying, well, now, no matter who you are, if you own a few units of the system, you're going to have some influence over it. Not a lot, but some. And that's proportional to your amount of ownership in the system. But we can augment that eventually as the systems evolve with other factors. Like we can layer in not just your ownership of a token, but also, are you providing resources? Are you a valued member of this ecosystem? Like if we're in a liquid democracy system and you're a delegate for lots of votes, maybe you get a better chance of winning to get a block. And that's measurable within the system. If you're providing a lot of bandwidth to people or storage, maybe you get a little bit more chance to win. So we're just at the infancy of a very long conversation, which will take years to decades to work our way through, about biasing the proof of stake model to include more than just the raw ownership of the asset. And what this effectively means is we're not just talking about consensus, we're talking about your value in the system, whether you're a good actor or a bad actor according to some collection of metrics that we've determined are good. And that's Darwinian. Some people will get it right, some people won't. But it's a really exciting time. And ultimately, I think that proof of stake will overcome proof of work as a dominant consensus system. Proof of work will still be valuable, but it's going to change the way it works. It's more about saying, I want to build a decentralized grid computer, a la folding at home, and I am using a system to bring these types of nodes together. Proof of stake is hitting the crux of the who decides and who pays and who's valuable and who's not, and how do we empower people and hold people accountable for the decisions they've made. Now, the very same mechanisms that you could use for that, you could also apply to platforms. For example, if you're the Sargon issue with Patreon, or the deplatforming of conservative people on Twitter or YouTube, wherever you fall on that political spectrum, this is an issue where you have these systems where we build them, we make them, we make Twitter, we make Facebook. Many people come together and create the product. And there is no product without us. But then you have an unelected dictatorship that basically decides the rules of the game and can change them arbitrarily, including destroy your entire livelihood arbitrarily based upon their political whims and wills with no oversight or checks or balances. That model will die. That model must die. We kill kings. We kill dictators. Humans have moved beyond that. And we look at kings and dictators as terrible things. We should never regress back into that for the sake of expediency or necessity for how we get our news, how we interact with people, or who has legitimate opinions or not. So they have to go. But what do you replace it with? Well, we're talking about a system where we're trying to decide who's good to interact with and who's bad to interact with, what's correct good behavior, what's not so good behavior. So the same concepts that allow you to determine that for who should be in charge of running the chain can also be potentially reused to say what is good information versus what is bad information. And you can collectively reach a decision about good members or bad members without having a leader at the top. It's just an organic process that occurs. That is where we're going with this type of technology. This is what we're thinking about with this type of technology. And it's something that makes me profoundly excited because I think that this is a problem that can be solved in the next 10 years. And what this effectively means is it will kill the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Reddits and these other platforms and replace them with infrastructure that is a public good, that is self-sustaining, that allows people to express themselves in the ways that they want without fear of reprisal. Now, another thing that really is interesting, is closely related to this concept of control and value, is this idea of penalties. You know, if I pollute, there are a lot of countries in the world that think it's a good idea to just say you're allowed to do that as long as you buy carbon, just pay the right priests off. You know, so there's all throughout human history this notion that sometimes we behave badly, and if we pay a fine, we are allowed to recover from that bad event. Now, we run into this terrible problem that social infractions, for example, of the Moore memo or other things, where some people believe that people have said or behaved badly, they've done something that's socially irresponsible. Instead of just saying, say you're sorry and we'll move on, there's a group of people who think that there's no way to come back from that, and the only way to solve the problem is by destroying that person's life, deplatforming them, robbing them of their economic livelihood, firing them from their job, making them a social pariah, and there is no forgiveness, none. I mean, maybe 20 years in the future, you can crawl back and beg for table scraps, but no, it's total destruction, total burn the person down. Isn't it an interesting thing that we could one day potentially have a system where you could behave badly, you could maybe be a little sexist, maybe say offensive things, and if you're caught doing that, there's a tokenization of these things, and you could pay a pittance, a social token, and that gets you back into good graces, and it allows you to become a proper member of society again. And if you consistently behave badly, you go socially bankrupt, and then you get kind of isolated off. But if you only occasionally do it, you can recover a little bit. And then everybody just kind of looks the other way and they say, well, he paid the price. This is not only a hypothetical, it's actually being thought about by governments and institutions, for example, social credit in China. And this carries very profound implications, both negative and positive, for the gamification of human behavior and for also our ability to say that certain members of society are productive, good members of society. We all tend to sometimes break the rules. Sometimes we speed. Sometimes people don't pay for a train because it's only one stop and it's late at night. These things happen. And does it necessarily mean that people are bad actors? Interesting question. Now, cryptocurrencies are also on the forefront of that because at the end of the day, they're incentive engines. They allow you to create value and distribute that value amongst people and decide who ought to get it, who will not get it. It's an interesting concept. So proof of stake is at the heart of all of that because it creates a foundation of research, a corpus of research, which ultimately can be repurposed for all of these things. Whether we're talking about a social credit system or a penance system for indulgences, or we're talking about carbon reduction, or we're talking about incentives to clean up the oceans, or we're just talking about who should we listen to in an information stream without nominating a dictator and having that dictator have total control over our lives. It's pretty interesting. Okay, what else do we got? And if you haven't figured out by now, I tend to give people very long answers that go in different directions. Some people truly hate this, and some people really like this. And I like to believe that the people that really hate this have already left the ecosystem, and they are now happy purchasers of EOS and Tron. People hate it when I do that too. Some people like that. Where are we going with this? Come on, guys. I'm looking for an interesting question. Something with lots of meat that people find interesting. Well, hello from Turkey. What area of Turkey? It's a beautiful place. And Nipapows versus Mimblewimble, well, they accomplish different things, but even if they did the same thing, Nipapows are awesome, and I think they're better because we invented it. Hi, Charles. Can you speak more about the coffee smart contract case in Ethiopia? Oh, sure. That's going to be a fun one. And you know, what's the end goal? Where do we want to go? Okay, so let's say you go to Starbucks and you have your cup of coffee, and it has and this is 20 years in the future, like far in the future. You always have to start with the end in mind and kind of work your way backwards. Stephen Covey did that in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He said, start with the end in mind. If you die, what will people say at your funeral? Okay, so we have our cup of coffee, and I have my cell phone right here, and I scan the QR code. Now, what just happened? I get some information on my app, and it basically tells me what's the story of that cup of coffee. We don't think about stories with fungible goods and products. When you see one bar of gold versus another bar of gold, you don't particularly care what the story is. It's gold. You have your cup of coffee, it's coffee. But what's happened is, as a society, we've moved to an evolved state and say, look, we live in an algorithm-rich, data-rich environment. And as a consequence, we can now actually talk about where the beans in that coffee came from, and then give that information to the consumer. And what does this mean? It means that you, as the consumer, now have, for the first time ever, the ability to understand if those beans meet your values. And you say, oh, you're just being a liberal flu. You know, only bearded hipsters from Boulder care about that. Okay, well, what if you find out that those coffee beans were harvested by slaves, people who were actually held at gunpoint and forced to harvest them? Would that be okay? A lot of people say no. What if you find out that those coffee trees come from a region where, to plant those trees and maintain those trees, it caused dozens of indigenous species to go extinct? Giraffes and other things, they just died out because they harvested that farmland. Would you be okay with that? Some people, yes, no. Okay. So the point isn't to say, well, this is good or bad by an entity like a government. The point is rather saying, by tracking these things, you as a consumer get to make some decisions. Now, we're already starting to do that, and we're doing it in a very crude, ham-fisted way, and it's a little dishonesty. Like, for example, organic or vegan friendly, or these types of things. They'll put labels on, and you know, maybe there's regulation, maybe there's not, or non-GMO. That's another thing. The point is that systems are being built today for the purposes of fair trade, carbon reduction, sustainable farming practices, whatever they may be, that will inevitably allow us 20 years in the future to be able to scan that cup of coffee and understand the story behind that product. And the hope is then that you, the consumer, getting that information, can now be a more discriminating consumer. You're already a discriminating consumer when you look at 2 products and one says made in China and the other says made in Japan or made in Germany or made in USA. Just by stereotypes and brand bias, you'll think that the Chinese product probably is inferior to the German product or the Japanese product or the American product. Because you say, well, Chinese goods tend to be mass manufactured and made at a very low cost. So, you know, all things considered, maybe the German product is better. Now, that might not actually be true, but you believe that because of biases and stereotypes you have. When you go to a big data world, instead of going into the aggregate and just believing something because that's your mental model, you actually can go into the particular for the first time ever. Okay, so that's the abstract. Now let's go to the particular. Let's actually talk about what we're doing in Ethiopia. So what we're doing in Ethiopia is we have a 3-part model for how we do government contracting. Part 1 is where we enter a jurisdiction and partner with the ministry, usually science and technology or education, you know, something that has a techie feel to it because they control the universities that are connected to the universities. Pilots and hire locals to run those pilots to look at verticals like ag tech, for example. We're very obsessed with that in Ethiopia, coffee. And we'd like train a bunch of people and teach them what is a blockchain, how to be a good programmer, how to use our tech that we're building. and also just how to think around how to build these types of applications. Okay. And they always say yes. They say, you want to train people and hire them and give them nice, high-paying jobs. Oh, yes. No, no, please don't do that. No, they always say yes. So they say, okay, let's do that. Then we build a class in negotiation with them, and we send out our best and brightest that we have. The best we have can offer. Lars Muñoz, he's a brilliant guy. We send out Polina as well. She's great. And they go there and they say, we're going to teach these people Haskell or something. And that's a great way of filtering the class. Should they pass it, then we know they're rigorous, they're good candidates, and we hire them. If they can pass, we hire them. So in the moment, we have 23 people, all women in Ethiopia, 19 from Ethiopia, 4 from Uganda. The class is about halfway through, and we see some great, very encouraging progress. And I hope they all pass, but the standard's the standard. We don't discriminate by gender or race or culture. We say this is the standard, and they have to measure up. And if they measure up, we hire them. Okay. Then stage 2, we go and do pilot. So you crowd out Ethiopia and you say, all right, let's look at a particular region where it'd be really cool to build out a supply chain. And what does that mean? It means that we find an area where we can model from start to finish, from the farmer's trees to the donkey that they put those beans on the back, to the washing stations, to all the logistic networks that get it to the central exchanges to sell it. We can model that whole thing out. Then once we model this whole thing out, then we say, how do we identify each person in that chain? Then after we identify each person, what is the metadata about it and what types of transactions? And we might even write a DSL to actually model and describe all of these types of things. Then how do we get information into the system? And then how do we incentivize information to enter the system? And that can be through group loans. Like if you do this, you get money for stumping. That can be that you get higher prices on your beans, and we can subsidize that through many models. It's a complicated affair. But anyway, basically, the pilot kind of figures these things out. Then once that model is built, and you'll notice that we have locals who are interfacing with the people. So they understand the culture, they speak the language, but then we also have our engineers working with them as well. So both sides are doing some great things. That pilot then constitutes feasibility analysis to scale this across the entire vertical. So if it works there, we'll try to take it to all 1.5 million coffee farmers. Now, how do we deploy it to them? If we have a sustainable model, we set up a company, a subsidiary, and it's a partially owned subsidiary. We give the government some of the equity, the employees on the ground some of the equity. We might even make it a co-op where we give the farmers some of the equity. So it's owned by the people in addition to us. And we can offset the cost of deploying to all 1.5 million through venture capital, through impact funding, through international grants. So we can go to the government and say, we roll a whole system and you don't pay anything up front. And then every time something enters the supply chain or the supply chain is used, you have to pay a small toll for that, which is affordable. But in aggregate, you're talking about millions and millions and eventually billions of transactions. And that sums up to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue with something that'll eventually run the entire market. So it becomes a hyper-profitable, franchisable, white-labelable piece of infrastructure that I can take and put across the entire vertical in different countries. Now, what else have we done? Well, I just didn't build a supply chain. I took 1.5 million people and I gave them cryptocurrency wallets. I gave them the ability to transact and manage private keys. And that ledger, because I built it, is going to be interoperable with Cardano, which means I just brought 1.5 million users into Cardano. That's why I don't give a shit about partnerships and these other things, because at the end of the day, we're not going to win in the Western world to begin. It's a rigged system, guys. JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs and these other guys, they've already won. They've already rigged it. And if it becomes a big deal, you don't think Amazon and Facebook and Google and Microsoft aren't going to come and play with their billions of users? What the hell is it going to do for me when Microsoft coins built into Windows and they have 2 billion users, or Facebook coins built into Facebook Wallet, into the Messenger, and they got 1.5 billion users, and it's a cloud application, so they have a great user experience with that. It works on mobile. I'm not going to win that fight. But guess what? I can win the Africa fight. And by aggregate, that gives me 500 million users to 1 billion users, and it carries our values. It's decentralized, it's free and fair, and it's helping some of the poorest people in the world create wealth and rise up. And what does that mean? It means that then that gives me collective negotiating power to actually get reasonable regulation. Because I say, if you want to be interoperable with my system and make trillions of dollars working with these people who have now become wealthy, you have to be fair. So you have to think about self-sovereign identity, and you have to protect people's privacy, and you have to give them control over their assets. They have collective bargaining power. So instead of just accepting the dictatorships of these tyrannical companies, we can now actually create much better, more efficient systems and kill the middlemen of necessity. We can burn their companies to the ground and replace them with things that are owned by all of us. Open protocols, open systems, no middlemen. Now, there's still room for entrepreneurship, but then that means the only way you make money is if you do something, you create something. You don't make money by rushing your way to a monopoly and then making a deal with the government to preserve your monopoly and stop society to go towards. I'm not comfortable with it. I think it's a dark road to go down. So I'm going to go to Africa, I'm going to go to Asia, and I'm going to win there. And there's billions of people there. And there's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth there. And by the way, if you're talking about cryptocurrency adoption, who buys cryptocurrencies? Who uses cryptocurrencies? Young people. And where are the youngest people in the world? 70% of Ethiopia is under the age of 30. And the vast majority of those people are internet able and have heard and in some cases use cryptocurrencies and are used to the idea of mobile money and grew up in a monetary system where the government money sucks. And they've had to do things about that already. So when you go and make the case that cryptocurrencies are a better system, would you rather be selling it to 55-year-old pensioners that listen to Fox News? Or would you rather be selling it to the people that are actively looking for an alternative? And by the way, their economy is growing at 10% per year. Think about that. You know, so that's the key. And then once you get these people in, you're in a position to negotiate, and you can negotiate with leverage. The dumbest thing you can do in the world is go and say, give me X when you have no leverage for X. It's like asking for a raise to your boss. If you are fungible, expendable, you produce nothing of true value, and you're just kind of there, you're like the door greeter at some store, and whether you're there or not, the business runs. You can't go to your boss and say, give me a 50% raise or I walk. They say, Bobby, it's been nice having you here, but maybe it's time for you to retire. But if you happen to be in a key role of your company, you happen to be, if you walk out the door, they lose millions or billions of dollars. You've got a lot of leverage. So would you rather go to the US government or the European Union and say, guys, you don't do business with us, you lose $5 trillion, or you're going to be pushed into a financial collapse. So let's talk about how we're going to do business in a fair way for the world. Or would you rather go and say, out of the grace and goodwill of your heart, can you please, please, please help me? Can you please, please, please do things the honest, moral, right way? What position would you rather be in? You asking for the same thing. And that's the key. You see, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to with a Pan-African strategy and go to Asia, and we're going to build up a way of getting millions, eventually tens of millions, eventually hundreds of millions into our system through enterprise public-private partnerships that make systems better. There's international desire to build these systems for carbon reduction, fair trade practices, and sustainable farming. A lot of money available through direct foreign investment, impact funding, and the governments themselves. And the infrastructure is about ready to do it. We're going to go do that. We're going to go put it in. And then once we're there, we're in a real great position to collectively bargain and make sure that regulation doesn't go insane. I do not want to live in a world where you have to have an escrow of all your private keys and give that to the government. I do not want to live in a world that to use Bitcoin, you have to be a licensed money service business and get $1 million worth of licenses. I do not want to live in a world where at any given time, usage of a system to express your opinion may result in you losing social credit and then eventually being exiled from society. Just don't want to. And the things that will push the world in this direction are tyrannical, centralized, hierarchical companies that are preserving their power. And if we do nothing, the default state will be to move in this particular direction. The only way we can prevent that is to depower these structures. And the only way we can do that is through leverage. And this is how you create it. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. That's our strategy. If you don't like it, there's 2,000 plus cryptocurrencies in the world. And there's lots of other companies doing interesting things. And, you know, go buy XRP. They're playing in the Western world, and they're the Ned Flanders of cryptocurrencies. If the regulator says spy on your customers, they'll find a way to do it. But for me, I have principles and values, and I just wear them on my sleeve. And Some people hate me for them, and some people love me for them, and that's just the way it is. Craig Wright. I've got more money than your African country. I ever tell you guys the story of that? You know, I was in Rwanda, and I knew that somebody from his company was going to speak on a panel that I was on, but he wasn't on the agenda, so I didn't know he was there. And I find out I'm on a panel with Craig Wright like an hour before I go on the panel. And I'd never met him. I just knew of him. And very distasteful guy, so fuck it, why not go and talk to him? Okay, so we're in the back room getting ready for the panel, and Craig comes on in, got his phone, and he's looking at it like this, and the guy's trying to brief us all about how the panel is going to be, and every about minute he just lifts his head and yells at that guy, says, "No, you're wrong, and I'm right. I have more money than you, and I'm right." And the other guys were all just looking at each other like, who the hell is this guy? Jesus Christ, you know, did he not take his wheat? Did he not eat his Wheaties this morning? I mean, what's going on? So I told the moderator, I really don't want to speak on this panel. And they said, no, you have to. The president of Rwanda is here. You know, it's a big government event. It would be irresponsible to bow out. And I said, all right, well, I'll go do my speech and I'll sit on the panel. But when he speaks, I'll walk out. So I did my speech. And when he spoke, I walked out of the room. And then we were on the panel. And it was just amazing, the answers that I saw to some questions and the mentality that this guy had. I control everything. I'm smarter than all of you. I patent everything. The good news about the cryptocurrency space is that over time, over the years, not necessarily the days or weeks, we seem to be pretty good at eventually exposing and riding out these types of people and increasingly isolating them. And I hope that that's what happens in his particular case. If that is how we're going to go and what our party's all about, I don't want any part in it. I don't think it's really going to accomplish anything. I'd rather just go work for DARPA. You know, at least you get to see something you want there. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Sorry for the tangent, but I just really do not like that guy. And I'm sure he doesn't like me. I ran into him in Yokohama, and he gave me a pretty big scowl. And he says I'm a scam artist. But, you know, Dan says that too. And I'm going to Denver tomorrow, so we'll see what they say. There's thousands of Ethereum people, and I'll kind of walk in, and we'll see if these keyboard warriors will say to my face what they tell me over Twitter. Hey, Charlie, if you work for a company, you would have been fired long ago. There are deadlines to meet. You can't take forever with any project. Let's talk about deadline. We get criticized all the time for that. This is going to be fun. Y'all ready for another Charles rant? Everybody fired up for that? Here's the thing. You know, let's talk about the Microsoft HoloLens, and let's talk about Natal and research. If you came to me and you said, hey, I got a great idea for a product. It weighs a lot. It gets really heavy, you know, after you wear it for a few hours. It gets hot, $3,000. It's got a short battery life. And this augmented reality headset, it's got a field of view like this. And boy, am I not doing a great job. You know, if you try to ship that as a production consumer product and expose that to the general public, so it would be the biggest flop of all time, and you'd just be laughed out of industry. So why is the HoloLens not labeled as this extraordinary failure, and Microsoft is yet again incompetent, and this company, you know, just a wannabe, and they're not real? Well, because we all understand that it's a real revolution in terms of investment banking and finance in general. We'll unfortunately see the consequences of a lack of control, of anarchy. There will be scams. There will be plenty of people who run around and defraud people because they know they can. I think this is going to be one of the great fun challenges to explore. If we can accomplish that by 2030, I think that the cryptocurrencies will have become the greatest innovation of the last 500 to 1,000 years. Hi, I'm Charles Hoskinson, Chief Executive Officer of Input Output Hong Kong. We're a cryptocurrency company and a research firm that specializes in the science of cryptocurrencies. So I first became interested in cryptocurrencies in 2011. I read a wonderful white paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto, and I had known about peer-to-peer technology for quite some time. For example, I knew about the BitTorrent protocol and Napster and these types of things, and I noticed the evolution of the technology. So it was really interesting as a paper, really interesting as an idea, but I really didn't think that it was a sustainable market. I said, oh, well, we have these imaginary tokens. Who's going to buy them? Will they ever achieve liquidity? And even if they do that, the government will just shut it all down. So I didn't take it too seriously until about 2 years later, right around 2013, when I noticed that despite the fact that the system had taken many hits and scandals and other issues, that it exhibited a tremendous amount of resiliency. And then from there, I said, boy, it would be really interesting for me to do something in this space. But I didn't know anybody. So I remember an old adage one of my professors said, which is those who cannot do, teach. So I created a free class on Udemy called Bitcoin or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Crypto, because I'm a big Peter Sellers fan. And so I kind of named it as a spoof on Dr. Strangelove. And I just created a bunch of free lectures. I released them as a Creative Commons license, and I expected maybe a few hundred people to take the class. Well, it turned out I got over 70,000 students for the course, and I got over 5,000 emails in the first year that I hosted it, and I answered every single one of them because it was a fun experience. So I got to meet everybody and got to learn a huge amount. The venture I'm usually most known for is Ethereum, which I started shortly after setting up Invictus Innovations with Vitalik Buterin and several other people. So to understand Ethereum, you have to understand Bitcoin and what problem Bitcoin solves. So Bitcoin is all about saying, can I create a money system where Alice and Bob can transact with each other in a trustless way with a decentralized database recording all those transactions? So in other words, when Alice sends that transaction, it gets recorded in some magic ledger in the sky, like a giant spreadsheet in the sky, that once it's in there, it can never go out. It's tamper resistant, and it's immutable, and it's time-stamped and auditable. So that's a wonderful concept, and that alone, with the notion of digital scarcity, allowed a currency to form. But the minute that you have a currency, people immediately start saying, well, what else can I do with it? Is it just the ability to move value between Alice or Bob? What about the story behind that value, the metadata, the context, the contractual relationship? For example, what if Alice says, I'll mow your lawn if you pay me $100? Well, that's a contract. So what if Alice mows the lawn and Bob doesn't pay her? That can't be reflected in a system like Bitcoin. So what we wanted to do is add a programming language to a blockchain so that these bespoke custom transactions could be coded much the same way someone would write JavaScript in a web browser. And that in turn would allow people to have any type of financial relationship that they wanted to have. Very simple relationships to arbitrarily complex relationships. So this was kind of the naive notion that we had in 2013 for Ethereum is, can we add a programming language to a blockchain so that we can then allow people to facilitate more complex commerce, known as smart contracts. The best projects are projects of frustration. So most of the people who started Ethereum, they didn't start and say, hey, we're just going to go build some magic new blockchain and it's going to have all these capabilities. And they did this in a clean room in a very academic way. They all started working on other projects. For example, Jeff was working on Mastercoin, Vitalik was working on Color Coins, I'd been working on BitShares, and each and every one of us had the same scenario where there was something we wanted to do, but the nature of blockchain technology or the nature of blockchains that had already been deployed made it very difficult and time-consuming and expensive to do these very simple things. So we had to say, there must be a better way. So what occurred was that Vitalik started aggregating really good ideas that he learned from Sergio Lerner, ideas that he learned while working on Color Coins and Mastercoin, and kind of stitched them all together into an initial white paper. Then, like all open source projects, that attracts attention. If it's a good idea. And so we started appearing out of the ether and discovering, hey, this is an interesting thing. I'd like to help and collaborate. And then somewhere along the way, we decided that it was a good idea for everybody to meet each other. So really the turning point between this is a discussion about a cool thing we could do to something that we actually wanted to devote time, money, and effort to was in January of 2014. Most of the Ethereum founders met up in a beach house in Miami for the North American Bitcoin Conference. It was a wonderful trip. And we had an opportunity to really seriously discuss not only the technology and what it would require, but also the philosophy. What are we actually trying to do? Now, from that, we had reached an internal consensus that this is something we'd like to pursue, but you can't just build a product in isolation. You have to actually go show it off and see if anybody cares. So we thought we were all crazy. We'd show the world and they'd say, we don't care about this stuff. And there'd be no interest, and we'd just all go home and go do something else, maybe start a bakery in Hawaii or something. So what we did is we went to the conference. We did some presentations. Vitalik presented at the conference, and I did a debate with Dan Larimer and David Johnston. David represented Mastercoin, Dan represented BitShares, and I represented Ethereum. And we got almost like a Mick Jagger-esque rock star reception to our presentation. Vitalik, for example, right after he presented, was mobbed by people, and it took nearly an hour to pull him out of that circle of people who had questions. So we realized that we had something very, very special. The problem is then, now we have momentum, we have something special, we have a group of people that are willing to do it. You very naturally go to the next question, which is, how do you do it? Where do we do it? How do we execute? And that was the hard part, the devil in the details behind Ethereum. That's a long story, but I'll try to make it concise. So after Miami, we took a vote, and we tried to decide whether we were crypto Mozilla or we were going to be crypto Google. And these kind of meant two different things. So crypto Mozilla is saying, let's do a not-for-profit organization. Mozilla is the maintainer of Firefox and projects like that. Crypto Google is a great patron of open source software, but ultimately it's a for-profit business. So these are very different models, and they have different notions of how these things ought to operate. So we took a vote, and initially the vote was 8-0. For all the founders said crypto Google is the way to go. So I went to Switzerland, and we started examining how one would set up a for-profit venture that would build a protocol and launch the protocol through a not-for-profit foundation. So I lived in Zug for several months. We got tax rulings and did very complicated work, all in German, which was quite fun. I ate a lot of pretzels and gained a lot of weight. But that's how these things always operate. And then somewhere along the way, around June of 2014, we eventually had to make some hard decisions. And the decision was made to reverse that and move to crypto Mozilla. And some people left the project, myself included, as a consequence of that. And the remaining people set up a foundation, did a crowd sale, and moved on. So I never thought at that point I'd ever get back into the Ethereum space. I said, well, my time is over. I enjoyed the 6 months I was there. I learned a lot. I met a lot of interesting people. I enjoyed the beautiful vistas of Switzerland. So it's time to go do something else with my life. So I suppose the easiest way of thinking about an ICO is it's just basically a mechanism, a decentralized mechanism for somebody to raise capital. It's a very neutral thing. It's not a pro thing or a negative thing. It's just a gateway that allows capital to flow in. So the very first ICO that was done was Mastercoin. And the beautiful thing about this mechanism is just how incredibly simple it is. So with Mastercoin, the founders of that project just listed a forum post at Bitcoin Talk. And they said, hey, we're doing something interesting. If you like it, send some Bitcoin to this specially formed address. And that was that. And that's basically what occurred. And they raised $500,000 in a month. And everybody was just blown away. They said, wow, I can just create a forum post, put an address up, some text, and then suddenly $500,000 appears. So that's the basic notion of it, is this idea of saying, hey, I'm going to do something, here's how you pay me, and then using a cryptocurrency as the value transfer mechanism. But more broadly, an ICO has become formalized because there's now a lot of more tools and functionality and interesting things that one can do. The first ICOs were all kind of meta to the system. You had a Bitcoin as the value carrier, but all the terms, the conditions, the liquidity, all these things were kind of outside of the system itself. So somebody had to go and build Mastercoin and then find a way to issue a token in Mastercoin. And it was a very bespoke, time-consuming process that took months. Now with Ethereum, what Ethereum has allowed people to do is define that once. It's called the ERC20 standard. And then they can take that ERC20 contract, issue as many tokens as they want, and then go ahead and issue a sale. People swap Ether for ERC20. or what have you. So what this has allowed people to do is it's kind of democratized access to this new fundraising mechanism. It has allowed thousands of people to raise billions of dollars all throughout the world without actually having to physically meet the people that they're raising money from, and in some cases not even knowing who they're raising money from, because it's being done over the internet through these types of payment systems. So it's an incredibly interesting mechanism. It's like crowdfunding on steroids. It's not an entirely new concept. We've had things like Indiegogo and Kickstarter for years. The difference is that now Indiegogo and Kickstarter have been disintermediated, and also that the payment system itself no longer goes through the standard financial system. So banks and financial intermediaries are not involved. It's now a direct peer-to-peer payment system between people. So this obviously causes a lot of regulatory questions about how this model is going to survive, thrive, and stay within compliance, given that the legacy system never imagined that such a system like this could exist. First, the magic of ICOs is that they have now made everybody equal in terms of their ability to raise money. There's never been a time in human history where we've had this power. So, ordinary days, if you wanted to be an entrepreneur, get venture capital, you have to go where the money lives. So that's New York, that's Silicon Valley, that's London, Beijing, Tokyo. There are certain cities where that kind of value aggregates and the people who dispense it aggregate. So you go and come up with your great idea and go on the road and go live somewhere. Well, for a certain group of people, that's a perfectly fine proposition. The young and the affluent, or those who are in a position to take a risk. But let's say that you have a brilliant idea. Maybe you want to run a decentralized grid. Perhaps you're in Haiti or in Puerto Rico or somewhere, and you've just had everything destroyed by a hurricane, and you say, instead of rebuilding an old, stupid grid, let's build a really good grid, maybe with solar or something like that, and have the people own it. Well, that may be a wonderful idea. You might have a great business model. There might be a lot of passion behind that, but the issue is you have no access to capital. So your only option is to either fly capital to you, which seldom occurs, it's luck usually, or you have to leave and then find a way to somehow bring that back home and build relationships. So people in the developing world or people outside of these zones have historically always been at a disadvantage. What the ICO does is say, your geography no longer matters. Many ICOs have been done from very small countries like Barbados, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and so forth, and have been able to raise money on par with what you would expect from Silicon Valley and from New York and these other large capital hubs. That's a very powerful, very prominent, very amazing thing. But with great power does come potentially great problems. Some of these offerings could be construed to be securities offerings, especially where these offerings require centralization for the end product to work, or they have no product that they're selling and they're using it to finance the construction of the project. So as a consequence, it's very unclear about how legacy laws will fit into this new fundraising model, and also unclear about what jurisdictions ought to take precedent. Normally, when one raises money, they raise money in a particular place, let's say California. Then you would say as an entrepreneur, I have to keep the state of California happy and I have to keep the U.S. government happy. Those are the two constituencies. It's manageable. Lawyers know how to do this. When you do an ICO, you could end up raising money from 10,000 people in 200 different jurisdictions. In some cases, jurisdictions on embargo lists like North Korea and Iran. So in that case, how do you actually manage that? Or do you even know who your customers are if you're not doing know your customer and anti-money laundering compliance? So these are some of the great challenges of ICOs, is that while they increase liquidity and they put everybody on equal footing, and it's a real revolution in terms of investment banking and finance in general, it also introduces the issue that there is a gap of good governance, good regulation, and good compliance that would allow people to produce a good outcome for these things. So anytime there are contracts, markets, transfer of value, and an expectation of return or a potential for fraud and abuse, there is universal consensus that there needs to be some notion of governance behind that and recourse in the event that people fail to meet their obligations. So the role of the government, at least in a Western sense, is to be the arbitrator of last resort. It creates levels. It says, okay, well, for markets that are very efficient, work well, and are generally not filled with fraud, the government does tend to stay out of those markets. But for markets where there's just too much temptation, there's conflicts of interest, agency failures, these types of things. In those marketplaces, the government feels necessary that it has to have some form of a role. So this is kind of a contrast between, let's say, journalism or things involving written content and the financial markets. In the first case, it's completely unregulated. Most part can say whatever the heck you want to say in the United States, and everybody just finds a way to deal with it. Whereas in the financial markets, they tend to be the most regulated of all markets, not because we started that way, but because we've had consistent collapses. From collapses in the 1880s with gold deflation to the Knickerbocker crisis in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century to, again, another crisis in the Great Depression, to the crisis of the 1970s, the S&L crisis, long-term capital collapsing, the dot-com bust, the Enron scandal. You can just keep going down the line. And in every single one of these instances, usually what occurs is the government says that there was some area that we probably should have been regulating or understand a little bit more about, and we now are going to step in. For example, at Enron, it resulted in the creation of Sarbanes-Oxley, whereas in the 1930s, they decided to create Glass-Steagall to separate retail and investment banking. And both of these were probably pretty good ideas within the context of society. So there are two modes of thought on should the government have a role or not. One of them says, yes, the government ought to have a role, and that role ought to be very hierarchical, meaning the government is the final say of this matter, and that we should adapt existing regulation to now cover cryptocurrencies in a way that makes sense. Whereas there's another group of people who say that due to the nature of this technology and how incredibly transformative it is, where now money can move at the same speed as information, at the same speed as an email, it's intrinsically global, and it's impossible to really know how much people are really making because of this new paradigm, that it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to actually regulate it in a conventional sense. As an example, if you take a look at how conventional MSB regulation works, money service businesses, it's not the regulatory agency that acts as the watchdog. They actually delegate their eyes and ears to the financial institutions themselves. We have a notion of something called a suspicious activity report, which says if your customers, you the bank or you the exchange, are doing business with, are doing something that seems a bit suspicious, you have a legal obligation to report to the regulatory body on your customer. So what does that mean? That the regulatory bodies have turned all of the money service businesses into their eyes and ears, into their watchdogs, and by extension have a pretty good handle on the conduct of everybody using those pipelines. But when you move to a cryptocurrency setting, there is no longer that third party to file a suspicious activity report. And as a consequence, the only way that the regulatory body is going to get data on these people is either A, finding it themselves, or B, having people report it, self-report, which generally doesn't work out so well. So when we look at the totality of this problem and the fact that a lot of the tools that regulators traditionally use to maintain control over the markets and a lot of the tools that regulators need to use to maintain order are not present or superseded by cryptocurrency's advancement, as well as the very rapid advancement of cryptocurrency technology, it does seem to be a Pyrrhic, almost Sisyphean effort to actually regulate the cryptocurrency markets the way it's done in the legacy system. That said, if there is no regulation, there are no controls, it's the Wild West, you will unfortunately see the consequences of a lack of control, of anarchy. There will be scams. There will be plenty of people who run around and defraud people because they know they can, and they can hide in some jurisdiction. So there's kind of a good, a bad, and an ugly to all of these things. My personal opinion is that we need to take a measured hybrid approach. There are cases where we probably can institute effective legacy regulation. And there are cases where we can use things like self-regulatory organizations, voluntary standards, things like smart contracts to compensate for the fact that these markets are different and also start enforcing best practices. And the other point is that if the consumer, the market, knows that they have to look out for themselves, they start making accommodations for that. But one final point of caution, which is if governments do choose to take too draconian of a measure on cryptocurrencies, this will not stop the market. There's never been really a case in human history where there's been a demand for something and the government decides to ban it, where all of a sudden people stop using it. From prohibition to the war on drugs, all of these things, we've spent trillions of dollars, put many people in jail, and yet these black markets continue to grow. So if there's utility and demand, there will always be a way. And the problem with cryptocurrencies is that they're just so darn hard to stop. As anonymity technology improves, as these peer-to-peer protocols become more resilient, as they start working their way into mobile devices, it's going to become harder and harder to know how much people even make every year, unless they self-disclose these things. So if we look to analogy, for example, the Hollywood's war on file sharing and the lack of success that they've had there, if regulators do choose to have a very aggressive stance, in my belief, it's not going to actually protect any consumers. It's just going to reduce the overall availability of information and ultimately cause more harm than good. I think the biggest risk of ICOs is not necessarily the specter of government intervention or this idea of is it a scam or not. It's more that because of this disintermediation that's occurred by the nature of the technology, the people who conduct ICOs tend not to have as strong of a relationship with the people whom have given them money. You know, there's an unspoken and sacred bond when you run a business. When somebody capitalizes that business, gives you money, you have a relationship of trust with that person. That person had to work really, really, really hard to get what they have. And what they've done is they've taken it, voluntarily given it to you. And you're going to go and take that money and hopefully, build it up, make it strong, and come back with more of it, more value for them. If it's a donation, that's fine, but it's the same notion. You've taken their money and they want you to go do something, maybe build wells in Africa, what have you. So the issue is when you now no longer know whom you are getting money from, there is a tendency to dehumanize these people, to say, I have no relationship with them. I have no obligations to do anything for them. I don't have to care about them. And if you read a lot of the terms of sale for the ICOs that have recently been coming out, they're using semantics such as this is a donation, there's no expectation of return, there's no expectation of delivering a product. If we take the money and go to the French Riviera and just decide to live an opulent lifestyle for the next 5 years, you can't sue us, these types of things. Now, under ordinary circumstances, no investor in the world would ever agree to that and ever finance a business that has that kind of prospectus. But because of the nature of these markets and the fact that there's going to be liquidity and the initial investor may be able to resell that token to somebody else and recoup their investment regardless if the project ends up being successful, it has created a moral hazard. And this is something that the community, regulators, and investors in general need to have a broader discussion about how we're going to overcome this. For example, there needs to be segregation of capital. If capital is raised, it needs to be stored somewhere where the people who have raised it don't have immediate access to that capital, and there are some sort of controls over that. Second, there needs to be a better relationship between the buyer of the token and the person delivering the project. Now, it's not completely unfair to say that this lack of a relationship is solely because of the negligence of the person issuing the ICO. In some cases, because of draconian or very out-of-date securities laws, just by giving basic investor protections and basic investor participation, you're tacitly admitting that this thing ought to be regulated as a security. That's a very unfortunate artifact of old laws that ought to be updated, where they're intended to protect somebody, but in consequence, to avoid them, people are actually diminishing consumer protections. So basic things like this need to be thought about and done, and it goes back to best practices and community standards. Where do these standards come from? They come from failure. So if you want to know how to run a secure, good cryptocurrency exchange, you look at the people who ran insecure, bad cryptocurrency exchanges and say, what did they do wrong? Just like if you want to build a rocket, you look at the rockets that exploded and you say, what did we do wrong? And from those failures, you learn tremendously quickly on how to change things. And we've seen a tremendous evolution already. There's a lot more formalism occurring with the ICO markets. There are now ICO rating agencies, for example. They're very preliminary. They are starting to create some things. And eventually there will be stronger regulation, and hopefully that regulation will be quite intelligent and sensible and guide the market in the right direction. If it's not intelligent, not sensible, then unfortunately, as I said before, it's likely to result in the market becoming actually worse for consumers, not better. I love the oil and gas business. I've had a lot of friends and family who have been in these industries. If you look at how natural gas or oil or gold or any commodity is treated in the Western world, these are very competitive, reasonable markets, and people have an expectation that there should be a fair value for what they're extracting, and that's somewhat predictable. But if you go to the developing world where they don't have the expertise, the credibility, the infrastructure, and other such things to actually develop the resources, for example, Guinea with its bauxite has nearly a third of the world's supply of bauxite. What they end up having to do is go to China or to Rio Tinto or these other firms and make very predatory deals where they get pennies on the dollar for these natural resources. And they accept bribes or they accept some infrastructure play. But at the end of the day, they're literally selling something that could be worth $100 for $1 or less. So what if you could actually tokenize the development of natural resources? So you say something like, okay, we're going to survey this field for oil, or we're going to survey this field for bauxite or for diamonds. And then we're going to tokenize the entire production, and each token represents some ownership stake of that. Now, this kind of a way of going about things is not completely new. It's been proposed before, but now because of all these tools and cool things that we're getting in the cryptocurrency space, it gives us many more levers that we can pull to prevent corruption and to prevent theft or other such things from occurring, or cut off the flow of capital in the event that an agency failure occurs, even on the government side, perhaps. So this will allow smaller jurisdictions that really do want to compete on the global markets to actually get a fair price for their resources, which in turn they can use to reinvest in the community. As a corollary to that, if you look at infrastructure, for example, energy, water, all of these types of things, we're moving from a centralized model to a more decentralized model. It wasn't too long ago that Tesla announced the solar roof, and then before that, the Powerwall. But basically what they're doing is proposing a decentralized grid. So wouldn't it be a wonderful world to say, instead of having to build a $50 million or $100 million power plant to go provide energy for people in Ghana or people in Nigeria, for example, why don't we instead build a solar grid or a wind grid and have that be community owned? And these tokens actually represent ownership of that grid, and they can be ICO'd. So everybody in the world can now make money from a Ghanaian energy farm that's providing cheap, clean power to people in this jurisdiction. Or if we talk about, for example, foreign aid, instead of saying we're going to just give all this foreign aid to some hegemony in the country and hope they do a good job, foreign aid can now actually be participating on the open markets. The UN, for example, could buy some of these tokens in order to promote the development of water and promote the development of solar and actually get a return on these tokens. These are like new opportunities that are incredibly exciting to me, and they can do everything from creating a decentralized internet via a mesh net to things like utility services to the tokenization of natural resources. And I think this is going to be one of the great fun challenges to explore over the next 10 or 20 years as this technology matures. My great hope for cryptocurrency technology is that we stop talking about blockchain and Bitcoin and all of these things. We no longer talk about TCP/IP in the general public. In the early days of the internet, the only people who used it were very sophisticated, very technical people, and they were capable of doing so much. And that was because the internet could do so little, and they had to carry the load for them. So things like TCP/IP and these ideas, they kind of faded into the backdrop. They're necessary, they're useful. Technologists iterate and evolve and build things on top of them. But at the end of the day, the consumer doesn't care. The consumer looks at things like, does my Skype work or not? Am I having a good high-quality call, or is it crackly and there's high latency or something like that? If we can achieve the same thing we've achieved with the internet, that it just works and it just works well, but do that for money, then I think we can have some really magical, revolutionary things. For example, I believe we'll have this idea of a universal wallet. Just recently, I was actually on a trip throughout Europe. I was in Ukraine, I was in Greece, I was in Switzerland, and I was in London and England. And all these countries have one thing in common, which is they have different money. So Ukraine's money is different than the euro, which is Greece's money, is different from the franc, which is Switzerland's money, which is the pound, which is England's money. But I never once used a currency exchange, and I never once used a local money. I had my card, and every time I bought something, that card would go from US dollars to the local currency. So I actually didn't care what the local currency was. I just had to kind of in the back of my mind track what am I spending. So could you imagine a future where all of your assets live in a wallet, a digital wallet, where you have some tokenized gold and tokenized stock, but even more exotic things like tokenized airline miles? Or maybe you tokenize your house and sell part of it. It's like a reverse mortgage and you have some tokens in there. Maybe you pre-sell your labor. You put it there. And then when you go into Starbucks or to McDonald's or any of these places, they always will charge, let's say, in dollars. So when you go and tap your cell phone to pay, you're going to pay in airline miles or your labor or your house, and they get dollars. They didn't know that you paid in airline miles. That's some decentralized market-making network took care of all that process. Now, if we can get to that reality, we start caring a lot less about our local money. It doesn't really matter if you live in Argentina and the peso is not doing so good, because you can just rebalance your portfolio and say, I'm actually pretty long on the dollar. I'm just going to go for that. Or I like gold, so I'm going to store all my wealth there. So now what we've done is we have taken a person where their financial life is determined by geography, and we've now put them in the driver's seat of their financial life. They get to make the final say about their portfolio and how they store their assets. And by the way, every single one of these assets are going to be secure. They're going to be well accounted for. They're going to be free of fraud or a lot more resistant to fraud. They're going to move at the speed of light. You're going to be able to buy and sell them at a fair price. And there's no longer a siloing effect that occurs where your equities live here and your bonds live here and your currencies live there and your commodities live there. They're all just treated as the same under the same type of protocol, and they flow just as fast as email. If we can accomplish that by 2030, I think that the cryptocurrencies will have become the greatest innovation of the last 500 to 1,000 years since the invention of banking and the invention of the printing press. And that'd just be an amazing future to live in.
Welcome, everyone, to the Cardano Effect Podcast, Episode 1. The purpose of this podcast is to take information in Cardano and break it down into a more consumable manner. So we're taking that high developer information and breaking it down into chunks so everyone can feel extremely involved within the community. I want to thank everyone for commenting, and subscribing. It seems like we already have an audience, and I'm very excited. Thank you so much. Thanks for all of your support. So who is this podcast for? This podcast is for everyone. So if you just found this podcast by random, or you're on YouTube, you're surfing, and you've never heard of cryptocurrency before, this podcast is for you. If you purchased or invested in Bitcoin, or you've heard of Bitcoin and you just want to learn more, this podcast is for you. If you already have graduated to that Bitcoin stage and you're looking for an altcoin or different cryptocurrencies, this podcast is for you. If you've heard the term third generation blockchain and you want to learn more about it, this podcast is for you. If you are an investor, if you are an early investor, a late investor, you bought at the top, you bought at the bottom, you bought wherever, you could be an ICO investor, this podcast is for you. If you're a dreamer like me and you see yourself long-term within this ecosystem, this podcast is for you. And last but not least, if you have qualms with the project and you don't like Cardano for some reason, this podcast is for you. We are going to be including an email address down below in the description. It's called the cardanoeffect@gmail.com. So if you have questions, comments, or concerns, you can shoot a question over to that email address. We're going to amalgamate those, and we are going to do a Q&A session every couple of weeks, and we're going to try to get to as many community questions as possible. Try to sum everything up, and we're going to give the best possible answers that we can give. We may not reach to every single question, but we're going to try to get to every single one. And of course, you can always comment below. So before I pass the baton over to Rick, I want to preface this by saying that this is not financial advice, and none of what we speak of should be taken as financial advice. You are your best financial advisor. And if you don't think you are, you need to find someone that's qualified to do so, because it's not us. We are just a group of people who are very passionate about cryptocurrency, and in particular, very passionate about Cardano. So that being said, you take this and you listen and you try to absorb the information, but don't take it as financial advice. You need to do your own research. You need to do your own diligence. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Rick. He's going to introduce himself. He's the other host of the Cardano Effect, and he's also going to introduce our special guest. Rick?
Thank you, Philippe. I appreciate the introductions there, and also giving people a good rundown of what we're doing here at the Cardano Effect. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here. We're very excited to get this show on the road. This is our Genesis block of the Cardano program. This is getting our podcast up and off the ground. We hope this provides a really good communication medium for the community to get information out on Cardano and also receive feedback from the community. And Philippe did a great job describing that. So I'm just going to continue on with what we have here. So we have Philippe as a host. I'm going to be a host. And we also have our special guest tonight, Sebastian, who's also going to be a future guest host when we have highly technical things that are highly technical in nature. And we want to boil them down to, how can the average crypto investor understand how does this information apply to me and how does it make the Cardano ecosystem work? Okay, so that's just a little bit of description of what this podcast is about. And tonight's episode is based on the three primary people that will be working these podcasts. And in the future, we'll have other guests on based off of your requests, like I put out in the promo video. As we start getting feedback, and we did get a few pointers come back where people would like to get involved. So we'll get more information from the community in the future. So next, I'm going to pass over to Mr. Sebastian Guillemot. He's one of the Emergo employees who's been involved with the system for a very long time, and people know him quite well. So Sebastian, over to you, sir.
Hey, everyone. Maybe you've already seen me in my YouTube videos. I think we all do YouTube videos in this podcast, but my videos are usually focused on the actual technology, in the sense that I tend to go over the papers, over the code, the specifications, this kind of stuff, and try and explain it. The videos I make tend to be for a technical audience. That is to say, if you're not really familiar with technology and you want to understand the concept of Cardano, my videos may be useful, but you're not really the target audience. I try and make my videos for the developers in the ecosystem, right? So somebody who's curious about how the research is applied in more details and wants to build something either off of Cardano or similar to Cardano, they'd be able to go through my video, understand what's happening, possibly do some derivative research or works. And so that's kind of the purpose of the content I create. And that's essentially why it has kind of business value for Emergo, right? And so at Emergo, I do R&D in general. So I do some programming and this kind of stuff, but also I spend a fair amount of my time doing these explainer videos and explainer blogs and this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Sebastian. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go on to one of our first subject areas in this video in the Genesis block that I've been calling it. And so there's 4 subject areas and then a bonus discussion at the end, or 3 subject areas and a bonus discussion at the end. And the first area we're going to talk about is how did you get into crypto personally, each person here. Then the next one is how did you first learn of Cardano? Third will be why are you dedicating your efforts to Cardano, vice any other crypto? And the idea behind that question is, what makes Cardano worth investing your time and money promoting it and being involved? And fourth, if we get there, what does mass adoption mean? And we're not talking about one Lambo. We're talking about, how would the average person get to the point of using crypto? Okay, so if you guys are okay with it, who wants to lead off? You want me to roll with it, or how did you get into crypto?
I can start off. So I have to recollect all of my thoughts, but crypto started, I was aware of crypto back in, like everyone, you start with Bitcoin and you progress forward. But I first heard of Bitcoin in 2011, 2012, but I did not invest, unfortunately. I was in college. My brother and I were reading around and we found it online and, the whole dark web thing. And we just got associated within that, not to do any illegalities, just as business purposes, mining and whatnot. But that's where I first heard of Bitcoin, did not invest, did not mine. And I followed it for the years that led afterwards. And I really did not become an investor until May of 2017, so last year, so like a year and a half ago. And, I followed the Mt. Gox thing, and I was like, oh, wow, this is an issue. But then the whole Ethereum run and the hype started building again. And I looked into it a little bit deeper, and I was like, I need to get more involved in this space. I need to see what's going on. So that's when I first got into crypto. That's when I first learned of crypto. And from then, I've been literally eating, breathing, and sleeping crypto for the past year and a half. I look at it all day, and I'm always on news articles and reading and researching. And one thing led to another. I jumped from Bitcoin. I found other altcoins that I found interest in, and and then it led me to here. And now I'm on this podcast with you. But that's my story about how I got into crypto, how I learned of crypto. And yes.
All right. So I guess I'll pick it up from here. So how did I get into crypto? Well, it started basically in about 2013, but it actually preceded that. But really getting into crypto started about 2013. I have two sons who first started getting involved prior to 2013 with different digital currencies. And I heard the name Bitcoin. So basically, I had heard of Bitcoin prior to 2013. And then in 2013, my son started mining little bits of cryptocurrencies using GPU miners like Darkcoin, Litecoin, Feathercoin. Then he got me looking at it, because being dad of four, of four kids, I had a busy life, and they're like, hey, Dad, check this out. And I'm always into tech. I mean, I kind of work into tech during the day and crypto at night kind of thing. But so I thought it was really interesting. I said, hey, this is a really cool idea. And I started mining Netcoin, which like completely crashed. It's completely obliterated. But that's how I first got into crypto. But my real first crypto, well, what really got my attention is my son was mining things like the Darkcoin and Feathercoin. And so I got some visual aids. I got some props here. I got to mask the private key. So like this Feathercoin. And he would sell them on eBay. So he mined it at basically the cost of nothing, and then he would sell it on eBay at a little bit more of the value because people could see a tangible object, right? They could say, "Oh, look, that's something I can purchase for like $5 for a paper certificate that was only worth maybe $2 or $3 or something like that." And then he would mail it to him because back then eBay allowed it. And I was like, wow, people actually like this stuff. It's not just a gimmicky hobby. If you can transaction this stuff on eBay, then there's some value to it. And so then real big on 2013, I bought my very first Bitcoin. There it is. It's a Cassatius coin. And that's when it really clicked. And I was like, wow, these guys are onto something because it's digital. It lives inside the computer. You can extract it and stick it into a physical object that other humans can hold in their hand. Because, and I was like amazed. So fortunately, that's my only Bitcoin. I wanted to invest a lot more into it. But that's really when the crypto bug got into me, was at that point. But what predated crypto was, in the late 1990s when I had silver coins, I would collect little silver coins and I go, wow, this is a silver dime. And its face value says 10 cents, but its value in weight was like $2.90, $3.20, and it kept going up. And then gold came about and I thought, oh, I need to get into that gold. But I never really had any money because I'm a working guy. So whatever money I have is what comes from my paycheck. And I was like, oh man, I should invest in gold, or I should take out a loan and buy gold, because I watched the price go from like $250 to $300 on gold. And I started realizing, boy, this is going somewhere. So, but I missed that boat. And then along came Bitcoin, and it went from like 250 when I bought it to 1,000. I'm like, oh my gosh, it quadrupled in value. I wish I would have bought more. And I thought I missed that boat. It was only $1,000, right? And then after that with Bitcoin, the next one was Ethereum. And I remember Julian Assange tweeting about Ethereum when it was only like about $60 roughly. And he put he said, hey, which cryptocurrency should WikiLeaks divest into, and he listed, he said Ethereum, Monero, and a couple others he put on that list. And Ethereum hit the top, and by the time the tweet ran its course over a couple of days, Ethereum was like $62-65. Like, oh, I need to get into that one. And a year later, I was like, I missed that boat, So I was like, that was basically my history on crypto. So I was the average guy kind of buyer, just getting my feet wet and making all kind of novice mistakes. I mean, there's a lot of painful mistakes to be learning crypto. But anyway, that's basically how did I get into crypto in kind of a long and convoluted way. All right. So Sebastian, what do you have to say about this? How'd you get into crypto?
Yeah, so I came in about 2013. Right. So I had seen on Reddit and whatever, like price of Bitcoin hits 1,000 or whatever. And I was like, I've heard this a few times before. Like, why is it hitting in the news all of a sudden? I should kind of check it out. And kind of read up into it. And it's like, oh, this is kind of an interesting concept. I studied math and this kind of stuff. And at that time I was, just starting university, but, I was, studying math and this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, it's a pretty cool idea. Like, if you tried to build a currency on kind of a mathematical basis of some kind, right? And so I was looking into it, and my little brother's friends, like a few of them owned some Bitcoins, and like, oh my God, we just made a huge amount of money and whatever. And they're kind of talking about it, like, oh yeah, this is so cool and whatever. And I mean, I don't have enough money to buy anything. I didn't really even have any money at all. Like, I just entered university or whatever. So I didn't buy any or whatever, but some of my little brother's friends were like, oh, we can, send you a small amount over for you to kind of play around with, get a feel for what it's like, what the content of it is, how to install a wallet and what it means to transact with Bitcoin or whatever. So, we got a small amount from them. And then, we spent it on a few stuff. Like I bought, a Humble Bundle, which is like a bundle of video games. It's fairly cheap purchase. And they accepted Bitcoin at the time, and I'm not sure if they still do. And, I tried out, it's pretty painful. You're writing this like, UI, this wallet with like a really terrible UI. It takes like 3 days to sync the client at that point. I forget how much it was, but it's like a few days to sync the client so you can finally receive your coin. And then you like send it over to purchase the Humble Bundle. And it's like, please wait. And you're like waiting. You're waiting, you're watching, like, what happened? Did it just disappear into thin air? Like, what happened? But no, it just turns out Bitcoin has like a really long confirmation time. And I was like, I was impressed by the concept, but then I realized, like, yeah, it's not that great. Like, there's a huge amount of flaws, and this is like really hard to get into and whatever. So I was like, clearly somebody must have improved on this. For any research problem, like ever, if the first version comes out and people try and improve on it and whatever. So I started looking into like kind of what are the alternatives around. So I checked out a few other like altcoins at the time, and there's some pretty cool concepts at that time also, but nothing really interested me. So I kind of just dropped out of the space at that point. That's kind of my introduction to crypto.
Well, that's interesting. So all three of us came from three different directions and end up landing at roughly the same point. All right. Thanks for that, Sebastian. Philippe, we are on the next area is, how did you first learn of Cardano? Now, I led off with on the first round with how did you get into crypto? Oh no, wait, Philippe led off with how did you get into crypto? So Philippe, you want to lead us off with how did you first learn of Cardano?
Okay, well, I first learned of Cardano through Charles's whiteboard video, as did many people. It was a great whiteboard video released at the end of 2017, I believe November-ish. It might have been late October-ish, but that whiteboard video really introduced me into Cardano. But I want to give a little backdrop of my journey looking for this out. Like it just made sense. And, I was getting into crypto a lot more during the summer of 2017. I was investing, moving things around, looking at different alt projects. Like Sebastian was saying, a lot of them didn't catch my eye. I actually go and look through the white paper. Although I don't understand everything all the time, I still look to see if there's a business model behind it. And then I saw Charles's video, and Charles, he's very eloquent, And what he was saying resonated with me completely. And it really got the gears turning in my head. And I introduced myself earlier as a dreamer, as a person that literally wants to exist within a system. And I think that Charles provided that through that whiteboard video, because one of the things that he stretched on was this idea of interoperability. And this was a very powerful term to me. I saw that there could be a connection between, the bridge between the regular fiat world and the crypto world is sometimes very unclear. And that term really allows me as an investor to understand that, it's not one system dies, the other prospers, but two systems can live simultaneously. And, that's just what really led me to this project. I bring some props as well. And I have a story about this whole idea of like people within the system and moving on to crypto. And basically, I was at the bank the other day, and this lady next to me was saying something around the lines like, oh, she went up to the teller, and it was probably 9 a.m., 10 a.m. in the morning, and the line is full. And of course, you're waiting in line to get your money out of the bank, which doesn't make much sense. But the lady in front of me goes up to the teller and asks the teller, can I have can I withdraw $1,000? I'm going on vacation next week. And it was the weirdest question I've ever heard, because like it's the person's account with the person's money and they're asking like permission. I know it was meant as more of a lighthearted joke, but like the Matrix thing in my head just like clicked. Like there needs to be just this system can't be the only one that exists. And then couple that with all the information that came out with the whiteboard videos and checking out the website and just seeing the level of professionalism and the level of business that IOHK does. I mean, not only was this like a dreamer cryptocurrency project, but IOHK is an actual legitimate business. So many crypto projects out there are not businesses. They do not run a business. And if you do not run a business on top of your project will fail, because the balance sheets are going to fall out of whack. As soon as your ICO money runs out, that's it. But IOHK is a cryptocurrency starter. They're successful. And that, coupled with Charles, coupled with the direction I saw the project going, that's really my introduction into Cardano.
All right. Thanks, Philippe. I'll roll with with this one here. How did I first learn of Cardano? Well, this is an interesting story. I was in my kitchen, and it was about this time last year, early November, maybe late October, roughly about this time frame. And I had just started leaning towards investing more into cryptocurrencies. And my sons were talking about ADA. Now, they were talking about all different kind of things. EOS was starting to come online. And there was a couple other ICOs that were big in name. I had not heard of the Cardano ICO, but it was about this time last year. And so I have two sons, and my one son was talking about it pretty passionately about the information. He said, Dad, you got to check out this video. And he pulled up the Charles Hoskinson whiteboard video that Philippe had just mentioned. And I watched this. Now, the interesting thing is, in my line of work, there are scientists who do this kind of work. I don't understand the math like Sebastian. Like Sebastian came, he understands the math. I don't get the math. I look at the final output product of these really brilliant scientists, and they'll explain to me how things work and how they develop the math. And as long as I can see the output product and understand it and use it as a tool to do my job, I'm good. It almost doesn't even matter what was that math in the background. And when I saw Charles explaining this, it really got my attention. And I said, I'm going to go find this stuff. And fortunately, my sons had already done the research on it, and I knew where to go find it. And I started getting involved with Cardano, started investing in it. And maybe a week later, a video from Dr. Duncan Coutts came out. And I was like, wow. Okay, I mean, these videos were starting to knock my socks off. And I thought, I'm not seeing this level of science and research being applied. there were the three big major factors that that Charles described what a cryptocurrency has to do. But once I started seeing all the research going into it, and I realized this is the thing for me, or at least this definitely has a future. So not really the business side. I wasn't even thinking of the business side. It hadn't even crossed my mind, as Philippe had mentioned, from the business angle that IOHK has, which is awesome, and Emergo has, which is great. What was crossing in my mind was the science behind it, and the fact they were doing all this research, and that there were white papers that could be read. Although there were many other white papers out on cryptos, that particular white paper caught my attention. So that's really how I first learned of Cardano. And as more videos came out from IOHK, it kept grabbing more and more of my attention. I said, wow, these guys are really, guys and gals. Meredith did one on security. And I realized, wow, they are very proactive in getting these videos out. They know how to communicate. And I think between the science, they're able to communicate science to me, the average guy, and they were able to communicate via these excellent YouTube videos. I mean, I just have to say they're great. That's all there's to it. And that's what hooked me. And that's when I said, you know what? I'm going to dive way deep into this line because I caught it early enough to where I can still, I can make money off it because that's all why we do this, but I can also learn from it and maybe somehow be a pioneer in this field, something that, I've never been able to do before. I hadn't caught it early enough, but this is one that I caught early enough where I could get heavily involved. And that's where we're at now. So that's my story. That's my, how did I first learn of Cardano? Sebastian, you're on deck, sir.
Yeah, so I kind of got back into the space as the hype kind of started building up around it. And I was like, well, I wonder what's changed, right? If the price is suddenly skyrocketing or whatever, like hopefully something's changed in the technology, and there's a reason for this hype. And I started looking into it, and sure enough, found Ethereum, and I thought it was a really cool idea, the concept of dApps and whatever. And so I started kind of doing a really deep dive into Ethereum, learning smart contracts, reading through the yellow paper and all this kind of stuff. And, obviously every project has its engineering flaws and whatever, so it's not a perfect project. But I was getting pretty involved in it, not in the community side, but just on the technology side. And at the same time, I was, keeping my eye out open for other projects. What else is going on in the space? How else has it evolved since I kind of came in last time? And that's when I found Cardano. And so I was reading Cardano, and the first line description was something like, cryptocurrency based off of Haskell. And I was like, oh my God, I got to read more into this. Because at the time, I was kind of like an amateur Haskler, which, kind of came naturally from studying both computer science and math. And so I was like, oh man, somebody's building a cryptocurrency based off this. I got to check this out. And I was looking into it more. I think what really hooked me was the fact that Cardano was a project with mathematical rigor. And this is like a concept that is, really drilled into you if you take a math major in university. The fact that whenever you make a statement, you have to have a rigorous proof for it. And the ability to write a proof that is rigorous and, understand the importance of a rigorous proof is basically what a math major is trying to teach you. And so, in fact, like one kind of story that stuck with me when I was going through, math courses in university was, I had like a third year course in math at some point, and we had a midterm. You get a midterm, you have an hour and a half to solve it. It's like 5 questions or whatever. And they're fairly long and complicated questions. And I was going through one of them, and I had the question right, except near the end, I like messed up, and I ended up getting a 0 on that question. I went to the professor, like after he handed back the, graded midterms, like, come on, a 0? Like I got the entire proof correct, except like the last part, I made some mistake and whatever. And his answer is, what, for mathematical, proof, there's, 2 results. Either it's true or it's not. In your case, it's not. And, if it's not true, it gets a 0. And, I think I still think that's kind of too strict for, educational purposes. But I mean, in the real world, that is true, right? If you have a proof and it's false, it's not worth anything, right? You made a mistake. And that's kind of the importance of mathematical rigor, right? You have to have a formal proof that your statement really is correct. And I thought not only the people working on Cardano respect this, they made it like a fundamental pillar of their project. And, there's other cryptocurrencies that do dabble in research and do dabble in implementation of research papers, but none of them really had it as a fundamental pillar such as Cardano. And that kind of got me really interested in the project. And kind of as I was going through it and the documentation and the code and everything I was reading through, I realized this is a very technical project. And if you don't have kind of a background on this topic, there's no way you could understand what's going on. And I thought, this is maybe a unique role for me to play in kind of an educational side, because I've always liked teaching people and this kind of stuff. And so, I even in high school, I used to teach younger kids. In university, I ran a mentor course for free for other students. And I always liked this kind of teaching stuff. So I thought, I can, leverage my knowledge to help people understand this. And so I started a YouTube channel to kind of, upload some videos of me talking about the project. And that's kind of how I got started.
So the next question in the lineup for today is, why are you dedicating your efforts to Cardano vice any other crypto? And this is in the context of, okay, we're putting, between the three of us here, we all have previous YouTube channels that we have created for Cardano related matters and other crypto related matters. And so this question is really asking, why did we pursue our efforts down the line of Cardano? And who would like to lead off? Are we going to continue the round robin with you, Philippe?
Sure. Let's go ahead. So why Cardano versus any other project out there? I mean, I know there's a small list of third generation blockchains. Why do I get attached to this one? Why did I pretty much dedicate my YouTube channel to Cardano? And the same can go for Rick and Sebastian. That's a good question. To tell you the truth, a little bit of what everyone was saying, the scientific and mathematical rigor of this project is incredible. And I know people make fun of this all the time on Twitter and on Reddit and on YouTube about this whole idea of peer reviewed, but it's a serious deal. If you've been to university, you've been to college, and you've written a paper and you've had it peer reviewed, or you've submitted a thesis, and it doesn't even have to be for math, it can be for any subject, you realize how difficult it is. Because it's one thing to know information more than the next person. So if there's a cryptographer, he could tell me what cryptography is, and I'd have to believe him solely on the fact that he's a cryptographer and he knows more about that subject than me. But to submit a paper to an academic conference, the top conferences in the world, and every idea that you have, you write it into a paper and you get it peer reviewed, that's a whole nother ball game. I mean, they're getting their papers reviewed by other people that are pretty much geniuses in the field, regarded as geniuses in the field. They've innovated, they've created new things, they've invented things, and all their life revolves around figuring out what the best math and the best science is for that particular topic. And I just don't see any other projects going forward. So if you're telling me that you're a third generation blockchain and you're implementing this protocol, you're doing proof of stake, or you're putting something in your project, I just have to believe you solely because you told me that. I can't verify it. But if someone else is verifying it who's an expert on that field, that just boosts up the credibility. So I think that's one of the most underrated features of Cardano. And it's a reason why I gravitated towards this project, because there are checks and balances in place to protect the entire project's integrity. I'm not a coder. My brother's a coder. And it's like he codes and there could be a sloppy line of code in his code. And I'm not sure. I can't tell him it's a sloppy line of code until someone else finds that sloppy line of code. And I feel like Cardano puts processes in place to prevent these kind of things from happening, or to limit the amount of glitches that are going to be going on within the system. And at the end of the day, we're playing with people's money here. I mean, people are investing a large amount of their net worth into this project. Whether it's good financial advice or not, we all know that people are putting more than they're willing to lose into projects. And we know that people are going to want to, if it accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish, people are going to want to live with inside the ecosystem, which means that a large portion of people's net worth is going to be in this system. So do you want to be in a system that wasn't peer reviewed or wasn't audited 1,000 times or wasn't looked at by the experts in the field? Or do you just want to say, oh, this person said so, so it is? And I truly believe that Cardano, when I looked at Cardano, it's really one of a kind in the field. I mean, all these other crypto projects, they focus on different use cases, but within the space of smart contracts, within this particular third generation blockchain, and comparing with Ethereum, which is second generation, it stands leagues apart because of the rigor that is attached to this project. And I think that this is why I gravitated to this project, and this is why I'll continue to follow this project. And I really see myself within this ecosystem.
All right. Thank you, Philippe. I'll go with the next one. So why did I dedicate my efforts to the Cardano project? Well, I'm kind of like the boiled frog. I didn't intend to. It just a sequence of events ended up landing me on putting more attention onto the Cardano project and the Cardano and ADA more so than others. So again, I go back to the time, kind of like revisit the time about a year ago today, and then work my way forward to now, the present. So about a year ago today, my only interest in Cardano was, ooh, neat science, very small price, big money on the way. And that was it. That's all I cared about. And that's what a lot of people, that's all they care about. And there was all these different cryptocurrencies laid out before me. It was right before the big bull run. And Ethereum, I think there were murmurs about Casper at the time, or if some sort of proof of stake, something that was going to improve Ethereum. There was talk about Lightning Network coming out for Bitcoin and stuff like that. And I had some electronic Bitcoin. I had some electronic Ethereum. Dash was another one. And so, you know, looking through CoinMarketCap, there were these top 10, and I would look down through the list and I go, wow, look at all these different cryptocurrencies. But over time, what happened is Cardano just kind of soaked in on me. Like I said, boiled frog. So by late December last year, there was this bull run kicking in. And then I heard of Emergo. And I thought, wow, there's other companies getting involved with this. I didn't know how the relationships worked at the time, but and I saw Emergo was based out of Shibuya, Japan. And I thought, oh, wow, there's a lot of Japanese centric here. And I know how the Japanese are. I visit Japan a couple times a year sometimes. And I was like, yeah, this is good stuff. So it kind of drew me in even more. And then Traxia, and I found out about that. And I was like, wow, I could get involved with an ICO, and I could actually get in on the ground floor of an ICO. And I have a Traxia t-shirt I was going to wear tonight, but it's a little bit too bright blue in this dark lighting. It made me glow like a ghost. I was like, nah, I can't wear that. But maybe next podcast, who knows? So anyway, I learned of Emergo and then Traxia, and the additional information about Cardano and where it was going, and all the different versions of Ouroboros, and the really cool names. I mean, the ancient Greek mythology names of Cardano really got my attention. I said, wow, that's cool. Like, I made a Reddit name a while back that was kind of Cardano related, and using ancient Greek mythology names. And I still had all these other coins, like Nano. Nano had an awesome community. They still do. Nano has an awesome community. Doge has this awesome community, but Nano is really coming up online. I have no idea how their security works, right? Nano is a super fast coin. And I was like, oh, look, I could get involved with Nano and I can support them. Not the ledger Nano, but the cryptocurrency called Nano. And they have a very engaging and very lively community. And then I found the Cardano forum. Okay, at forum.cardano.org, or however the URL is. And that was probably by maybe February or March, maybe earlier than that, of 2018 of this year. And the people in the Cardano forum were great. I mean, we had really lively and engaging conversations. We had controversial conversations. There were disagreements. There were people trying to help other people learn. And that's really what I liked. I was like, oh, wow, this guy's helping this guy learn. That fellow's having technical difficulties. And they had this technical forum where some guy, you know, could not get into his wallet because he had an error, whatever that error was. And here's two other people chiming in and helping that guy out. And they got their wallet fixed. And I was like, man, this is great. And these are volunteers. So that kind of inspired me. Now, I know other communities have that too, and that's great. I just didn't know that. You know what I mean? So that's one of those things where I got lucky and I stumbled across it, or I ran across the link somewhere during the course of doing some research. And so that's what really drew me in, was the characters and the personalities on the Cardano forum. Sebastian was there. I remember seeing him on there, and Philippe showed up sometime mid last year, maybe around maybe March, June, May. I don't want to put time on it. My memory is really bad with time. I'm getting old and it just doesn't tick out like it used to. But it was the community on the Cardano forum. I was not a big user of Telegram. I first started using Telegram like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Then there was that big Telegram hack, and my email address actually showed up on the dark web, which is a bad thing. And it was flagged by Experian, because I use Experian as my financial monitoring defense mechanism, or whatever you want to call it, you know. And they said, hey, your email address showed up on the dark web, and I've traced it and I followed the breadcrumbs and found out, oh, it came from the Telegram hack, or whatever happened. I mean, I can't say that for certain, for fact. It's just the little pieces of data I put together. So I stopped using Telegram. But then, so after I got involved with the Telegram forum, while I was there, I found out that people were using Telegram to communicate. And I thought, I need to see how that works. And I mean, how's it working out for that community? So then I got in on Telegram and found this very lively conversation. So the nice thing about the Cardano forum is you had these threaded discussions that were organized by subjects and organized by, you know, links, and you could make your own link. You could create your own subject. And that was great. And then I found out about Telegram, which all the cryptos have it. And I think it's awesome use of communication power. And I said, this is like the best thing since sliced bread. And the people in the Telegram were extremely helpful. And like I said, it was this lively, very engaging conversation in real time, 24 hours a day. And it just kind of blew my mind. And so I said, wow, this is cool. And at some point, I think it was about June, I started making my YouTube videos. I started with, this is how to. Like, my videos are, how do you do a procedure, which it really doesn't get a lot of likes, because people go, oh, that's how you do procedure. Okay, great. You don't subscribe to that kind of stuff. You just look it up when you need it, or you ignore it when you don't need it. But I started making those kind of videos because that's all I know how to do. And like, there's one on a Ledger, there's a thing on Traxia, there's a thing on Spade, which Spade plans on adopting Cardano, that I'd done on the videos. And then I found, wow, people really like these Cardano videos. I don't know if it's the name, like you put it in the name in the title, or you put the name in the metadata down below on the YouTube channel, but it garnered more attention. So although I was already kind of leaning into Cardano as it is, that kind of drew me even more. And I was like, well, these are actually working. So let me kind of like build momentum with Cardano, and then I can branch out into other directions. So that's where I'm at now. So I'm going to go back to doing other videos that lead outside the Cardano ecosystem over on my other channel, Digital Fortress. But here with the Cardano effect, now that we're here, I mean, this is why I dedicated efforts to Cardano. Now that we're here at this point today with the Cardano Effect podcast, we're going to branch out even more. So we're going to get a lot of energy focused on Cardano via this podcast, and through the brilliant ideas coming from Sebastian and Philippe. Both of them, they have great ideas coming out. We're going to branch out into other areas and invite people to where we can build bridges with other communities via this podcast. Okay. So speaking of great ideas, that leads us to Sebastian on why are you dedicating efforts to Cardano, vice any other crypto? Over to you.
Yeah, so it's kind of like what I was mentioning before with the mathematical rigor and all this kind of stuff. What it really boils down to is the reason I stuck with it is just, curiosity, right? I mean, maybe but the iOSK team is huge, right? And the Emergo team is also growing, more so this year than before. But, you know, there's a lot of people working on this project, right? And so at the time when I was, you know, getting involved in Cardano, I was still working at Microsoft as an engineer. And so, you know, that was taking up a huge amount of my time. But, you know, I would come back home every day and kind of read up on it briefly. And during the weekends, I would just spend my weekend, you know, sitting down and go through all the commits for the GitHub repo and just read all the code and figure out what's happening really at the low level scale. And then I'd make a video about it, going, okay, this is what happened this week. This is all the code that's changed. This is why the code's changed and what it means. Obviously, there's a huge limitation to what I could do from the outside, because, you know, if you're a software engineer, you know, a lot of the code comes, you know, undocumented based on some random internal discussion, right? So there's a limit to how much I could do. But just the fact that there was a seemingly never-ending stream of just content that I could consume to, you know, improve my understanding of blockchain, Cardano project. You know, sometimes you read some, you know, really good Haskell solution to a problem, you're like, huh, that's interesting. And sometimes you find some really nice mathematical solutions to a problem, and you're like, well, that's really cool. And so this kind of stuff just kept coming out. And in fact, like even now that there's more people working for RWK, there's more papers and code coming out than, you know, one person can keep up with. And so, you know, I try my best to kind of triage the material, like, okay, this thing I think it's worth spending my time looking into, this thing maybe not. And there's more cool things that I'd like to look into than I have time to spend in a day. And, you know, that's kind of sad. And so because of that, that's kind of one of the decisions that drove me to leave Microsoft to go work for Emergo, because Emergo was, you know, seeing my videos and this kind of stuff. And they were at the time thinking of starting an R&D department, right? And so Nico, who's the current CTO of Emergo, reached out to me. He's like, hey, do you want to join Emergo? Help us build our, you know, R&D department. I've seen some of your videos. It's really cool. And so I ended up joining that to be able to spend more time on Cardano to, you know, increase the amount of stuff I can look into. And, you know, it's been an amazing ride ever since at Emergo, where, you know, I basically paid to, you know, read these papers and read this code and build the project too, and, you know, write my own code. And this is really amazing for me. So this is why I've kind of, you know, stayed involved.
Yeah, that must be fantastic, being able to, well, for one, going from Microsoft, it's like, oh, Microsoft is a dream job. But then you have this, maybe to some people might think that, but then you see this new frontier that you're interested in, and you're like, hey, you know what? I can get on that early. And is that kind of how it went?
Yeah, I mean, it is part of deciding what I want to do with my life, right? Because I mean, Microsoft's really great. I loved working at Microsoft. The work-life balance is really good. The stuff I was working on is pretty cool, I think. But, you know, at the time I was working on Bing, the search engine, which I think is a team you can be proud of working on, because Bing really has, I mean, one, Bing makes a lot of money. And so you can be proud to know you're working on a project that makes money. But beyond that, I mean, Bing really has made search results better, even not through just Bing itself, but the fact that Google has to compete with Bing. You can see internally when we launch a feature and we improve our search results on one thing, a few months later, like Google comes and competes. And so you can visually see based on our metrics that, you know, we're making the world a better place. And so that's really good. But, you know, I thought I could have a bigger impact with Cardano and with my time on this project. And, you know, it's really exciting to be kind of, you know, this exciting field of research and be able to contribute to it. And so that was too appealing for me to pass up on. And also, like, even when I was working at Microsoft, it was really consuming my life, the Cardano project, because, you know, at Microsoft and my team, we had a system where every week one person on the team would present about new technology, just to make sure everybody on the team is aware of what's happening in the space. Because oftentimes when people have kids and whatever, they stop really looking into the technology and they kind of start falling behind. So to avoid that happening, Microsoft encouraged everybody to keep learning, right? And so every week we'd have a presentation. You know, I did one about Ouroboros, and I explained all the papers and how it works and whatever. And people really loved it, and I got really good feedback on that. I was like, wow, people, it's not just me, like people really love this subject as like a research field. At the time when I was doing the presentation, I made a point of not mentioning blockchain. It was like a purely, what if you had a distributed system, you wanted these properties and whatever. And I feel like people are much more receptive if you just don't mention blockchain. You mention it as a mathematical problem you're trying to solve. And then there's a Haskell meetup in Seattle that I went to every now and then. I said, hey, I should do a presentation on the wallet specification at the Haskell meetup. So I went through the wallet specification, how it is, how it's programmed in Haskell, and how that kind of all works together. So I was, doing all this stuff as if it was like part of my job already, and people really loved it. And so that's also one of the reasons why I thought this is a great opportunity to make it my job by joining Emergo.
Well, that must have made for a really nice transition. And plus you could take, the things that you learned from Microsoft, you maybe consciously or subconsciously, you could like roll right into, roll that into what you do to Emergo. All right, Philippe.
Yes. So what's the last question, Rick? That was a great answer, Sebastian. I think that's really cool. And I mean, if people are not understanding exactly how big that transition is that Sebastian did, that's huge. I mean, like Rick was saying, Microsoft, you're working for Microsoft, or you're working for Google, or you're working for Facebook, any of these large Fortune 500 companies that run the world, and you kind of leave that to go to an emerging technology. Just shows you how much conviction you have to have within that emerging technology. And I echo whatever Sebastian felt to move forward. I mean, that's very reassuring, I think. I mean, I think that's a great story. I think you agree with me, Rick.
Yes, sir. I absolutely do agree with you. Okay, so I'm just going to roll this into the podcast. So right now I show 7:59 p.m. on my computer. So it's been about 50 minutes. We're looking at least another 10 minutes left. Yeah. We're going to go with a natural kind of flow on this podcast. So if it rolls over an hour, if it rolls up to an hour and a half, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to use the Joe Rogan rule, and the Joe Rogan rule is like an hour to an hour and a half. Now, what I'm not going to do like Joe Rogan is like bust open a bottle of Kabiki and hit a blunt. Okay, that ain't going to happen on this podcast. I've got my water or my coffee, and that's what I'm going to use. So we're looking at like we got at least 20 minutes left. And our last roundtable question here that we have is, when Lambo? Just kidding. Not when Lambo. We don't want to do it in that context. It's the question, what does mass adoption mean? You guys have probably heard Charles bring this question up. Many people bring it up. I've seen this on other podcasts and other YouTube channels that are dedicated to mass adoption or discussing mass adoption. And there's some really good podcasts out there. And I highly recommend that you review those. But we're also going to touch on subjects like that during this podcast. So what we'll do is we'll roll over to Philippe and try to get, what does this mass adoption thing mean? How does that fit for you?
Rick, that's a great question. So I think that's like the billion, or if you want to consider it, $1 trillion question for cryptocurrency, when mass adoption. And people have been touting that mass adoption is coming soon. It's, it might be next month, it might be next week, or it might be in 2020 when the next halving happens. But there's a lot of conflicting answers as to what mass adoption is. And, people are under the assumption that everyone's going to drop everything and run to crypto. And I think that's highly improbable. I was talking to Rick a while ago, and I was saying that, people are still having trouble inserting their cards into the slots at like Walmart, like they still put it the opposite way. And then they're supposed to move to crypto. They can barely figure out their credit cards. So we've got to take baby steps in order to get to that quote unquote mass adoption. And like I said before, two systems can run in parallel and still exist. I don't think fiat is dying anytime soon, but there needs to be alternatives to the current system. This is what I brought props for, this question. And I'm Haitian American, first generation born in the United States. And both my parents' sides, they live in Haiti. And right here, this is the Haitian goud, which is the currency for Haiti. And as you can see, there's a 25, a 10, a 10, and various fives. So printed on freshly off the press. And the reason why I bring this today is because, one of the things that drew me to crypto was this idea of an alternate system. And Haiti is a very poor country. If you're not familiar with Haiti, it is a small little country in the Caribbean. and it's very poor. The average salary, minimum wage in Haiti, I mean, it used to be like $2 a day, US dollars. I think it's up to like $5.11. But the good has lost around 44% of its value in the past 5 years. So while inflation in this country happens at like around 2% per year, you know, third world countries and developing countries feel the effect 10 times worse. So what I'm trying to get around is like this whole idea that the rest of the world are going through some serious issues. The United States pretty much controls the monetary system for the world. So if they're experiencing a little bit of inflation, other countries are experiencing a lot of inflation. And the mass adoption thing, it's important because I think that value needs to be returned to people that actually produce goods and services for the rest of the world. While, you know, they may not be working directly for you, they're picking the goods and they're picking the raw materials that allow people in Western nations or more affluent nations to enjoy the lifestyle that they have. And one of the things that Charles mentions is this idea of getting the unbanked population within this ecosystem. So I think that that's when we can start considering mass adoption, the steps towards mass adoption happening. Moving people that are working, the people that are working from the ground up, that are living on less than $2 a day, or in the case that I just said, making minimum wage, let's say $5 US dollars a day, and are picking the raw materials that are going to get shipped to China or are going to get shipped to somewhere else for manufacturing of certain goods. They need to retain more value, and they need to make sure that they can grow their little nest egg, even if it's not a lot, but being able to have a bank account, having a crypto account, and have your money digitally available for you, and able to pass a little bit of money from generation to generation to generation to bring you out of that never-ending cycle of poverty. And I think that's where mass adoption starts. It's not like the United States and Americans and Europeans and you know, Japanese and Chinese people that are affluent. I'm not saying that everyone within these countries is affluent, but I'm saying that the people that are affluent within these nations, it's not about them moving all their assets to crypto, but it's about moving the small little guy and little girl onto the crypto platform and allowing them to grow as people, allowing their families to grow, allowing them to flourish. I think that's when we can consider mass adoption. But this whole idea of everyone dropping everything and running, it's just not going to happen. Not going to happen. The system itself right now, it doesn't work too well, but it works better than what crypto does right now. And eventually that things may switch, but for now, we need to focus on the people that are the most oppressed and then work our way up. And that's, I think, how we can quantify or the term mass adoption.
Hey, great points there, Philippe. And you know what? There's mass adoption is such a complex matter that there's so many different angles you can take to what you consider mass adoption. Like, I just learned something from Philippe. I didn't even look at it from the perspective, although I've heard other videos of talking about, you know, a lot of times we've got people from IHK traveling to like Ethiopia and other places, and they're trying to introduce it to people who need a financial system, a stable financial system. So that's one thing that would drive mass adoption. But I look at it from very many different perspectives. One of them is, how do I buy a taco with it? Okay, so to me that's like the benchmark question. When I can go to Taco Bell and buy a taco with ADA, mass adoption has been achieved, at least from my narrow-minded perspective as an American. Not that Americans are narrow-minded, but from a narrow perspective, if I could do that, to me, that's what a mass adoption would look like. I could buy a taco with it. That might be a common question that comes up is, hey, look at this really cool technology and all these great things we can do. And I love that kind of stuff. And then it boils down to, how do I buy a hamburger or something? So mass adoption, how do we get there? That then becomes a question. How do we get to the point of mass adoption? In my opinion, it's each one of us, those of us that understand crypto, going out and finding just one other person and explain to them how does crypto work? What is it? Why is there a benefit? Those are the kind of things that we can do to each person can do with mass adoption. I'm not a developer. The only thing I do with software is I break it by accident, usually is what happens. But developers are not going to create the mass adoption. Developers are going to create the technology. So we can't keep putting the responsibility on the developers and say, hey, when mass adoption? I'm just going to collect crypto and sit back and say, wait for the money to show up. I can't do that. We all have to take a little bit of part and get involved. There's something each of us could do. Of course, you don't want to be that annoying guy in the office that sometimes gets referred to as Dan and, always touting what cryptocurrencies are. But if you take the time to explain to one other person how cryptocurrency works, they'll have a better understanding. Like Philippe had mentioned earlier, and it was a real funny story too, was people putting their credit card in the machine wrong. That's me. I still do that. We have chips. The US is like halfway between slide and chip. And now the US is halfway between, once you stick your chip in, is it the green button or is it the red button? So now that I'm using my chip, now I got to figure out, should I push the green button or the red button to get my transaction to complete? And so even mass adoption, credit is considered mass adopted. It still has its issues every time they change something. So crypto is still way in its infancy. And everybody who knows crypto now, if you can just spell crypto, and I like the word digital, like digital currency, because crypto carries this really nefarious kind of sound to it. But anyway, that's just my preference. But if you can at least spell crypto, you could probably explain to somebody else how to use it or what it does. And eventually it'll catch on. If it's a good thing, it'll catch on because there's so many applications for it. And mass adoption applies to so many different areas. You got the stocks and bonds sector. You got the buying tacos and hamburger sector. And you have, like Philippe mentioned, you have the sector of countries that are in need of a better financial system. And so the mass adoption includes all these different aspects. So anybody can implement mass adoption. And speaking of developers and how developers can, do that kind of stuff, Sebastian, what are your thoughts? What do you think? What is mass adoption? What does that mean when Lambo?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like mass adoption kind of has two components to it, right? One of them is the actual usage of the currency, right? Can you really go buy a taco or this kind of stuff? And to a certain extent, there already exists an alternative economy based on cryptocurrencies, right? You can go around and use Bitcoins or ADA for a few various purposes. It's not used everywhere. It cannot be used everywhere, but there is some subset of the economy that can be sustained by this model. In fact, a few people spend their lives trying to live unbanked, right? They try and move 100% of cryptocurrency, and they kind of tweet about it or whatever. So there's that component to mass adoption. I think there's also the component of actual participation in the system, right? So if you do a survey right now in most developed nations, do you know what Bitcoin is, cryptocurrency or whatever, a huge percentage of people say yes. If you ask people, have you ever owned any cryptocurrencies? A non-trivial percentage of people will say yes, usually like in the single digits, 5-6%, something like that. And so you could say we've already achieved a certain amount of mass adoption of knowledge of the subject, right? Obviously, people don't have a deep understanding, but they have a understanding of this concept and kind of what it is and the fact that it exists, right? And I think to a certain extent, if we want to further this, then what we have to solve is kind of the participation asymmetry is what I like to think of it as, which is right now, if you look at cryptocurrencies, there's two kinds of people, right? There's the people, developing the protocol, which are highly involved in the project and all these technical decisions. And then there's everybody else, which is just the investors. They put money into it. And then that's the extent of their participation in the system, right? And they just hope something happens, right? And how do we drive mass adoption, not just in, the 5 or 6% that buy the coin, but the 5 to 6% that could join the project and get involved, And I think what that really boils down to is how do we get people to participate in stuff like governance and stuff like block creation and staking and this kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think, projects like Cardano can really help drive community participation. Because, if you get involved in the Cardano ecosystem as the project develops, then you'll be able to, build your dApp on the protocol. You'll be able to, deploy your smart contract. You'll be able to contribute to the core protocol if you want. But you can also just, participate in the staking pools and try and decide which staking pools you should join and which one is using the money it gains in the most moral way possible. And, maybe if you run a staking pool, you can, try and donate your proceeds to charity and get involved running something like that, or you can get involved in the governance project and decide which projects get funded and this kind of stuff. And I think this is a different kind of mass adoption, because even if the percentage of people that use, ADA to transact does not increase, the involvement in the protocol, if we get 5 or 6% of the population involved in not just buying ADA, but involved in the governance process of ADA and, deciding what the future of our protocol looks like, I mean, that's huge to me, and that's mass adoption to me.
So what you're saying, if I'm looking on Binance or Bittrex and I see this huge spike, a big giant green candle, and all this massive volume, that doesn't mean mass adoption, does it? Not really, huh?
No, I mean, the markets are always gamed. I mean, this has been a known fact in cryptocurrencies since the beginning, right? You look at the market, and it's like, there's some people with a lot of these tokens out there and a lot of time on their hand to play around with that money, and they control what happens. And I don't think the price going up or down necessarily revolves mass adoption. Often it represents that somebody with a lot of money or a lot of tokens is making some big play to try and increase their stack.
Yeah. And Philippe, what do you think? What is the magic benchmark that we might see that might say, yay, mass adoption has occurred? Is it a big giant green candle on Bittrex, or is there some other way of identifying what does mass adoption mean?
That's a good question. I've never really thought about that pivotal or that inflection point where we can say, when does mass adoption occur? I mean, I would have to echo both what you and Sebastian said about how, especially what Sebastian was saying about utility and people that are actually spending and involved in the governance within these crypto systems. If we can bump that percentage up, then I think we can consider ourselves mass adopted or go towards that mass adoption. But like this whole idea of, like, I don't even think that it's going to be at an e-commerce level. Like right now you can, of course, go and buy some socks with Bitcoin or ADA or whatever you want to buy with Bitcoin. There's probably a website out there to purchase it. But, I don't think that e-commerce is going to be the metric for mass adoption. I think it's going to be just maybe like a whole shift in thought, or a whole shift in collective thought of everyone that lives within like the traditional fiat society and how they view crypto. Because we were just mentioning price, and people still value their crypto in US dollars or euros or yen, whatever local currency that they have. So we obviously haven't moved to that point where it's the switch has been made. It's not like, how many ADA do you have? It's like, how many ADA do you have and what is that USD valuation? Or how much Bitcoin do you have and what's the price of Bitcoin right now? Let me put it in my calculator. Most people are still dead set on cashing out of the system. So I wouldn't consider that mass adoption whatsoever, because, what I see in Cardano is I want to live within the system. I want to hold my ADA, and when that thought process changes, I want to value my worth in ADA, not so much like, when am I going to cash out to buy this or buy that or put it back in my bank account, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense, because, if I go to Taco Bell and I buy ADA, what would it cost me today? I'm going to buy one taco for, I don't know, $1.50. So that's what, 20 ADA. So if I buy for 20 ADA this week, and in February, 20 ADA is worth $2, I'm going to say, wow, why did I do that? That did make sense. So I think you're right, Philippe. I don't know. Mass adoption might not be characterized by e-commerce. That might not, and how many websites will accept ADA for their product, or how many websites will accept Bitcoin for their product. I did recently hear that Starbucks is going to do, an experimental program again. I think they've done some kind of experiment before with Bitcoin, but instead of taking Bitcoin, this is what I've heard. Instead of taking Bitcoin at face value, the quantity would be, you take the amount of Bitcoin that currently translate to the US dollar, and then as it scales up or down, you would take the quantity of Bitcoin based on that new value, like a daily average or something like that. Because, we've all heard the story of the guy I call like the original Bitcoin guy. He bought 2 pizzas for, what was it? Was it like 10,000 Bitcoin or something like that?
Yeah, it was 10,000, I think. Yes.
Okay, so this guy buys 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin, and I'm grateful for that guy. I'm glad he did that. That is the person who started the ball rolling on mass adoption right there, as far as I'm concerned. Because if he didn't buy those 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin, my one little Casacious coin here I wouldn't even be able to buy a slice of pepperoni with it. So his sacrifice led to all of our benefit, and eventually it will.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
That's how I look at it. I say that guy made the sacrifice so that we could all play along. Satoshi did some great work in math, but that guy that got hungry one night and bought 2 pieces with 10,000 Bitcoin, you're the real MVP.
I heard he's doing pretty well. I think he had quite a lot of Bitcoin. So I read a follow-up article that he's living pretty large. So I don't think he took that much of a hit, but that is still a pretty big hit.
That is. At the time, it wasn't like, I don't know, Bitcoin was like less than a penny or something like that in value. I mean, it all starts from nothing. And the only way it gains value is that people trade it. And they trade it and they spend it and they trade it and they spend it. And then it starts gaining value and gaining momentum. Right now, everybody's a hodl. Well, you kind of got 2 categories of people that I've come across on the Telegram forums, because that's where I see most people. And what most people are doing is either they're a day trader where they're swapping between currencies to try to get a little more out of it, or they're just stockpiling and putting it away, but they're not exchanging it for either physical objects or something like that. And someday, I hope to see software developers out there. If you need ideas, just let me know, and I'll just keep throwing them out there. You probably already have them all anyway. But, like coupons. I go to the store just a week and a half ago, and my wife pulls out her purse. And, women's purses are these magical things that have enormous amounts of objects in them. And she goes, I forgot my coupons. And I thought, wow, if coupons were on a blockchain and you had it stored inside your phone, and you can just go click, 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 bing. Okay, there's my coupons. It'd be like, wow, that'd be great. So, these ICO tokens, they're all trying to be, not all of them, but they're trying to make a lot of what they call stable currency. I think it'd be great if you could put coupons on there. That's what I consider part of mass adoption. I think it would be fantastic if you could put movie tickets on a blockchain. And if I wanted, right now I'm sitting here on one side of the United States, and Philippe is in another part of the United States, and Sebastian is in Japan. And if I wanted to give him a movie ticket, I could go click, 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 bing, and I just gave him a movie ticket for Christmas or something like that. So that's the kind of things that when we can do that and buy the taco, then I think we're getting closer to what we call mass adoption, at least on the e-commerce side of the house.
Yeah, one thing I like to say is that I think for people in first world countries, I think the concept of mass adoption is kind of just a marketing ploy. So I mean, if you think about why is there such hype around cryptocurrencies, and part of it is because it's a neat technology, but part of it is because there's some people with large bags. I mean, they're trying to increase the price of their coins by any means necessary, right? And so there's this concept of mass adoption. At some point, they're going to switch, and then suddenly we're going to go into crypto wonderland or whatever. And it kind of misleads people. Because I think in a lot of cases, when people look at a new project or a new piece of research, they're trying to understand, how is this revolutionary? How does this change the entire world? But in reality, for people in the first world nation where we're already banked, we already have a bunch of fairly good services, a lot of stuff cryptography can provide is incremental changes and incremental improvements. They're not maybe such a big deal individually, but over time pile up. And so this is like something I've realized is a huge problem when trying to explain a project to somebody. Just in general, you explain crypto, you're explaining like, this way of using blockchain or whatever, and they're like, but I don't understand. Where's the revolution? Like, how is this going to change everything? Like, it feels like there's still a bunch of problems to this. I'm like, yeah, it's not a revolution. There's like this one tiny problem that solves, maybe improves a little bit, and there's some trade-offs to it. You have to pay for it more in this other way. And you can argue it's maybe an incremental improvement. And people have a harder time understanding these nuanced discussions. And so obviously, if you're in a third world country and you're going from unbanked to banked, or not banked, but to like being able to use cryptocurrencies to manage your finances, obviously that's a big change. But in the first world countries, this is a more nuanced potential improvement, right? This is why we say it's like an alternative system. The system may not be perfect now, but for most people in the first world countries, 99% of people, it's working good enough, right? And so a cryptocurrency may provide an alternative system with maybe some incremental improvements in certain areas, but it's not like revolutionary, in my opinion.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, because people have a different perspective from a third world country and what they see as something is adopted, and in a first world country is adopted, where, to me, it's like, can I buy the taco? But in a third world, it's like, can I store my value in some way that it won't be stolen from me? That's what we use banks for. It's an armored warehouse for your life savings. And another perspective about the third world countries is recently in Venezuela. Venezuela had that super inflationary problem where Philippe was saying that a tiny bit of inflation in the United States equals a massive amount of inflation in another country. And in Venezuela, the inflation got so far out of control, their money became more valuable to burn it to cook your food than it did to use it to buy something with. And so people were sending Nano. Again, I don't mean to keep reaching back to Nano, but this channel will reach out to other communities. And I've got to give props to Nano, at least from what I've read on the Reddits and on the news reports, is that people were sending it to Venezuela. And I can't remember the exact numbers. I don't want to quote myself on it, but they would send a certain amount of Nano there, and it had a lot of value to it, to where they could buy things like bottled water and supplies that they needed, because their money was in such turmoil. So their community was donating. They're like, okay, if I buy a little bit of Nano here, and that's the really cool thing about cryptocurrencies, is you can purchase it online and then load it on your electronic device of some sort, and then send it at infinite distance. And it gets to the other end reliably. Now they can use it. And so I thought that was really cool. And so I think that was just one more stepping stone. And as long as we see success stories like that coming and they continue to occur, then we're going to be in a lot better shape. Crypto will find that niche, that problem it can solve. As Sebastian said, is the cryptocurrency, it needs to solve a problem. Kind of, I don't want to quote you, Sebastian, but you solve a little problem here, it fits and it works, and then you keep moving forward, little small layers at a time, baby steps. So my opinion in general is mass adoption will occur. It'll be gradual. Someday it'll be here and we'll never even notice that it happened. And I think cryptocurrencies will kind of exist side by side with fiat, and there will be a relatively transparent relationship. And mass adoption will occur when we stop asking the question when mass adoption will occur, because we won't even realize that it occurred. So that's all I have on that subject. Guys, what do you think?
I think that this was good. I agree with both of your comments, your closing statements, and I think that we hit our first 4 questions for our podcast today, and I think that we did a good job. We can carry over this topic to our next podcast, and we're going to always be keeping the content fresh.